Welcome to MysteryCon, where the strange feels familiar and the truth hides in plain sight. The system said everything was fine, but secrets have voices. Some whisper from space, others rumble beneath the ocean, and a few walk among us. The truth isn't far away. It's already here. You just have to listen. Now let's begin tonight's story. They told the public the mission was about radiation sensors. What they didn't tell them was that I wasn't the first to land near the old Apollo sites, just the first to come back. The view from orbit was familiar, almost comforting. Grey, dust, craters like fossilized wounds, and shadows that seemed deeper than physics should allow. I'd trained for years to keep my heart rate steady on descent, but there was a moment, right before touchdown, when the telemetry stuttered. Just a flicker. My onboard systems called it a glitch. Still, it stuck with me. NASA doesn't launch billion-dollar missions on glitchy software. The public believed this was a solo recon op to retrieve debris and test for surface degradation around the Apollo 17 site. What they didn't know was that I had standing orders sealed in analog, a printed packet with no digital record, opened only once the lunar module locked on to the precise GPS coordinates provided in the final transmission. From the lost prospector unit. The thing is, there was no prospector unit, not officially. After touchdown, I ran the systems check, logged my voice memo, and stepped out onto the surface. Gravity felt as I expected. Light bounced off the regolith in that same slow shimmer I'd seen in training simulations. But as I moved west of the Apollo site, I noticed the first anomaly. The horizon didn't curve right. There was a slight depression, unnatural, like someone had once excavated and smoothed over an area the size of a stadium. I double-checked the maps. Nothing was supposed to be there. But my boots were now leaving the first human footprints across that basin in over 50 years. My comms remained silent, which was normal. Mission protocol dictated strict transmission, blackouts except for scheduled check-ins, but I swear I felt watched. That's not the kind of thing you admit in a log. Still I kept walking. Roughly 3 kilometers out, I saw the edge of something dark, peeking from the lunar dust. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by terrain, but then it shimmered slightly, like the heat distortion above a highway. It wasn't natural. I stood there for what felt like 10 full minutes. My vitals showed I was calm, but inside, something subtle had changed, a quiet wrongness I couldn't name. I marked the coordinates. I made a note to investigate later. But the truth is, I already knew whatever was out here wasn't part of any Apollo record. Whatever it was waiting. I waited until mission night cycle to pull the packet back out. I'd memorized the coordinates, but I needed to see the phrasing again. Retrieve secondary hardware. If no physical artifacts are present, locate the active signal source. Proceed with caution. External contact classified as conditional. The term conditional stuck with me. It wasn't standard language. I didn't sleep that cycle. Instead, I ran diagnostics I didn't need, checked oxygen tanks twice, and stared at the curvature of the moon's edge from the module window. There were no stars. Just a black so deep it felt like it could swallow thought. On the second lunar day, I returned to the depression. I brought the portable scanner, a tool meant for subsurface mineral mapping, but the return data didn't show minerals. It showed a regular geometric shape buried just under the regolith, octagonal, sharp-lined, and almost perfectly symmetrical. No natural formation could create it. I triggered the low-frequency ping, a passive sonar meant for ice detection. The moment it pulsed, the scanner rebooted on its own. Then something strange happened. The device, offline just moments before, began playing back a signal loop. Not static, patterned. The kind of waveform you'd expect from a man-made transmission, repeating at intervals too clean to be background noise. I saved the file. The second I did, my onboard system flashed a classified access warning. Not from the scanner, from the suit itself. Somehow it had synced to something I hadn't authorized. It felt like being watched again. I returned to the module, sealed the hatch, and replayed the signal on the encrypted console. It wasn't noisy, it was data, compressed, rhythmic, modular. Something I'd seen before, only in black box drills used to simulate hostile intercepts during spaceflight. But those drills were always terrestrial. This came from the moon. I isolated part of the signal, cross-referenced it with deep archive, telemetry. That's when I found it, buried in Apollo 17's final comm log. There were 5 seconds of identical waveform, flagged at the time as a recording malfunction. No one ever followed up on it. But someone knew. That's why I was here. Not to collect debris, not to test equipment. I was here to verify contact. The deeper I listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't a signal reaching out. It was a signal waiting to be heard, a beacon on standby, a test. The encryption on the signal was decades old, military grade, pre-digital, something you'd only find in Cold War archives if you knew exactly where to look. It took 6 hours to break it, working offline through the legacy decryption module. Hidden in my research tools, the data wasn't just audio. It contained coordinates, timestamps, and internal memos. The headers were stamped with a project name I'd never seen in any mission briefing, Operation Crownlight. It dated back to 1974, 2 years after the final Apollo mission supposedly ended lunar exploration. The files referenced phase migration, lunar transfer protocols, and Crown stewardship. All vague, sterile terms that hinted at something far larger than a recon mission. I kept digging. Most of the logs were fragmented, corrupted by time or intentionally redacted, but a few entries remained intact. One memo stood out. It detailed a launch that never made the news, a manned lunar departure from an alternate pad in the South Pacific, allegedly scrubbed due to technical failure. But according to this file, the mission went ahead. Destination, Shackleton Crater. And they didn't return. That was the first time I saw the term lunar crown. It wasn't a person or a place, it was a designation. The memo described it as a provisional authority established under the joint command of post-national actors, a phrase that didn't appear in any governmental structure I'd ever studied. I searched through a backup database hidden in my mission tablet, an offline archive for emergency navigation. Buried under old mapping protocols, I found a restricted layer labeled LCA1. Access was denied at first. Then, without input, the file opened. What loaded was a map, not of the moon's surface, but of something beneath it. Tunnels, chambers, vertical shafts. Someone had been here before me, and not just once. This wasn't an abandoned outpost, it was infrastructure, maintained, monitored. The map pulsed with a faint red dot, exactly where I had scanned that geometric anomaly. It wasn't just a structure, it was a door. and someone, somewhere, had just given me the key. I returned to the depression before first light, if you could call it that on the moon. The sun hadn't crested the ridge, and the shadows stretched long and cold. I carried the pulse drill, normally used to sample core rock, but I'd recalibrated it for shallow excavation. The regolith gave way faster than I expected. Beneath just 16 inches of dust and hardened silt, the drill struck something with a hollow tone. I cleared the remaining debris by hand. What I uncovered was a hatch. It was metallic, but the surface wasn't any alloy I recognized. Dark grey, smooth as glass, and warm to the touch despite the surrounding chill. In its center was a shallow indentation shaped like a crescent, flanked by 8 radial grooves. It looked ceremonial, deliberate. My suit's diagnostics spiked the moment I touched it. Internal temperature fluctuates, heart rate increased, comm systems briefly reset. Then, without warning, the hatch responded to my hand. Not a fingerprint or a code, just pressure. A soft hiss escaped the edges, and the hatch began to open inward, revealing a narrow shaft descending into blackness. The walls were lined with a seamless material that absorbed light, making it impossible to gauge depth. I anchored a line and began the descent. The further down I went, the quieter everything became, not just sound but sensation. Even the vibration of my breath against the helmet glass seemed to vanish. At 72 feet, the shaft opened into a chamber. My boots landed on a floor that looked like polished basalt but gave slightly under my weight. The room was massive, domed, with walls etched in the same crescent and radial motif. Along one side stood what looked like control surfaces, panels, with embedded symbols, none of them in any known language. And yet I understood what they meant, not the words, but the function. One was a console, another was a map. The largest panel showed Earth, not as a globe, but as an object of interest, surrounded by data points and trajectories. They hadn't just left Earth. They'd been watching it for decades. The lunar crown hadn't fled the Cold War. They had prepared for what came after. I didn't report the chamber, not officially. My scheduled check-in was due within the hour, and for the first time in my career, I considered faking a failure. I knew what I'd found wasn't meant to be discovered, not by someone like me. The air in the chamber, if you could call it, that carried no sound, no drift of dust, nothing to suggest movement. But the panels had changed. While I explored, they began to glow, faintly at first, then pulsing in sync with my biometrics. The central console lit up with a map of Earth's orbital traffic, displaying satellites, station paths, even classified military assets. Someone had been tracking everything from here. When I reached for the nearest panel, it responded with a sequence. Images, not text. The first was Earth, fractured into zones. The second was a group of figures standing before what looked like an old Saturn V rocket. The third was me, my face, my vitals, my mission patch, as if I had been expected. I froze. My name was listed beneath the image in English. Subject, Ethan Lloyd. Status, active evaluation. That was the moment I realized I wasn't on a mission of discovery. I was being assessed, tested. My every movement is monitored, my reactions logged. I climbed out of the shaft just as Earthside communications re-established themselves, clean, unaffected, but different. There was a second channel now, encrypted, running alongside the standard telemetry. I isolated it and found something I
hadn't expected. A voice. Not a transmission, but a synthesized prompt embedded in the data stream.
Proceed to crown level. Observation complete. The module had rerouted my return trajectory without alerting me. The new flight plan pointed to a rendezvous zone on the dark side of the moon, well outside the original mission boundary. I tried to override it. The controls denied access. That wasn't a malfunction. It was deliberate. My ship was no longer mine. I looked back across the surface, toward the hatch I had opened, and felt a shift, not in gravity, but in purpose. This wasn't exploration, it was an invitation, and I had just accepted. The new coordinates led to a plateau deep in the lunar shadow zone, where even Earth's reflected light couldn't reach. As the lander followed the automated descent, my suit's interface dimmed to a minimum, and the system displayed a single line: autonomy suspended. Await contact. Outside, the terrain was bare. No features, no tracks, just smooth, blackened rock that absorbed all light. At the center of the plateau stood a monolith. Not metaphorical, an actual structure. 10 meters high, slate-colored, and free of any visible seams. The moment I approached, a frequency emitted from my suit. I didn't trigger it. I don't think I could have if I'd tried. The monolith responded. A pulse, low and steady, passed through the ground like a heartbeat. Then it opened, not with movement, but by absence, as if the surface simply decided to no longer exist in one section. Inside, the lighting was soft, ambient, with no visible source, and they were waiting. 3 figures, human in shape, but taller, more symmetrical, and wearing suits that resembled our own EVA gear, but not manufactured, more like they were grown to fit. One stepped forward. No words were spoken. Instead, images filled my mind, memories, places, histories I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Earth in chaos. Governments dissolving, skies filled with debris from our own ambition. Then the lunar exodus. A breakaway civilization formed in secrecy, seeded by a coalition of Cold War elites and rogue scientists, backed by resources funneled through black-budget programs hidden even from national oversight. They called themselves the Lunar Crown, not as rulers, but as guardians. Their purpose wasn't to return, but to wait, watch, and decide. I was never here to retrieve old tech. I was the tech. A human signal sent to measure readiness, morality,
adaptability, my reactions, my decisions, every moment logged and assessed. The Crown had no interest in conquest.
Their concern was reintegration, but only if Earth was ready. The final image they shared was of a sealed archive buried deep beneath their colony, containing the identities of every living Crown member embedded in Earth's infrastructure. Politicians, economists, scientists. My return with that knowledge could trigger a realignment of power that no nation was prepared for. That's when they asked the only question that mattered. Will you tell them? I never gave them an answer, at least not aloud. The moment the question landed in my mind, I was back in the lander, strapped in, Earthrise on the horizon. No memory of walking out, no confirmation of how much time had passed. Just a fresh mission log time-stamped 4 hours after the last known entry, and a flight path locked in for re-entry. The data packet in my suit's buffer was small, encrypted, labeled simply return. I tried to access it twice. Both times, my system crashed and reset. I stopped trying. Back on Earth, debrief was uneventful, too uneventful. No mention of the alternate coordinates, no questions about anomalies, just scripted inquiries and polite nods. My report was filed, sanitized, and folded into a defense archive I was told not to access again. Weeks passed. I was reassigned to training ops, desk-bound, observed. But subtle signs began to surface. People I didn't recognize greeted me by name. A man in a coffee shop nodded once, then left behind a book with a crescent embossed on the spine. Inside, the words, "You
are not the only one who chose silence."
News cycles started shifting. Minor leaks about lunar reconnaissance, soft disclosures of ancient structures discovered by accident on foreign soil. Controlled, measured, like a slow turning of the wheel. And then came the dreams. Always. The chamber, always the three figures, always that same final question echoing through the silence. I've come to believe they never expected an answer. The test wasn't about truth, it was about choice. And I made mine. I kept the secret. Not because I was afraid, but because I saw what would happen if I didn't. Earth isn't ready, not for the truth, and not for the change it would force. So I write this now, not as a confession, but as a marker. For whoever finds this, when it's time. The lunar crown still watches. Their people walk among us. And when they ask again, the world will have to decide for itself. As for me, I returned from the moon. But part of me never left. They told the public it was a coincidence, 5 biotech billionaires dying within months of each other. But I don't believe in coincidences anymore. I've covered corporate malfeasance before. Fraud, tax evasion, secret mergers, all the usual sins of the elite. But this was different. This felt colder, more precise. It started with Raymond Dorr, founder of Genethera, a cardiac event at his mountain estate. Nothing suspicious, except he was the healthiest 64-year-old anyone knew. Then came Dr. Haruto Ling, known for pioneering age reversal therapies, found dead in his sensory deprivation tank. 3 more followed, all prominent in anti-aging biotech, all gone within 6 months. Most journalists moved on after the 3rd. I didn't. Maybe it was the way the autopsy reports vanished from public records, or the fact that their companies quietly merged under a new holding firm, Novamira Group, less than a week after the final death. On paper, Novamira was just a strategic alliance to continue their shared legacy. But something about it felt off. I noticed the wording in the press release. Continuity of vision. Not legacy. Not a mission. Vision. Like they weren't mourning the founders, just updating the hardware. I kept a folder on my desktop labeled Routine Deaths, half joking, half out of habit. Every few weeks I'd poke around, check obits, pull SEC filings, nothing major, just maintenance. That was until I saw the footage of Ling's lab being emptied at 2:14 a.m. by men in identical grey coveralls, no logos, no names. They moved like they weren't just taking equipment, they were sanitizing history. That's when I knew I had to dig deeper. I reached out to a former contact at the FDA, someone who owed me a favor. She sent me a file without comment. 1 page, heavily redacted, a name circled in blue ink, the vessel protocol. No context, no agency stamp, just those 3 words. I had no idea what it meant yet, but I couldn't stop staring at it. Vessel, not patient, not subject. Vessel. I didn't realize then that I wasn't just researching a story. I was walking directly into it. I started with the public records, but they'd already been scrubbed clean. Dawes' death certificate listed cardiac arrest, but the metadata on the PDF showed it had been edited 3 times in one day. Ling's obituary had no mention of cause at all, only vague tributes from former colleagues and a quote about crossing thresholds. I traced the holding company, Novamera Group, through a web of shell corporations registered in Liechtenstein and Dubai, eventually landing on a private trust called Enoch Holdings. That name didn't appear anywhere else in corporate databases, but a voice search on an old biotech domain led me to something unexpected. An archived internal site from a defunct research firm called Helix Path, one of the many startups quietly absorbed by Novamera. The site was stripped down, mostly placeholder pages and broken links, but one page had been preserved, an employee portal labeled V-Protocol Access Only. The page was locked behind a login, but the browser tab's title read Vessel Profile Registry. It was the first real connection. Vessel Protocol Registry. I took a screenshot, made a note of the IP address, and reached out to a friend in InfoSec. He owed me a favor. 36 hours later, he sent me a data dump, encrypted, messy, but genuine. It contained a string of personnel IDs, lab reports, biometric charts, and references to something called Phenotype Selectivity Index. The documents weren't written for public understanding. They were coded, clinical, detached. But one term showed up too often to ignore. Compatibility candidate. I saw lists of initials, dates of birth, genotypes. Some files referenced neuroplasticity, others referred to integrity decay risk. It wasn't until I stumbled on a partial memo that I understood the full context. It read, Donor pool expansion contingent on Phase 3 viability. Organic vessel retention under review. That was the moment my stomach turned. This wasn't about longevity research. It was about transfer. The people listed in those files weren't just patients or test subjects. They were being evaluated for something far more invasive. I was still trying to process what any of it meant when I noticed a familiar name buried in one of the candidate logs. Emma C. Craig. Date of birth matched mine. Status viable. I didn't sleep the night I saw my name. I sat at my kitchen table, lit by the dull glow of my laptop, rereading that file over and over. Status viable. No context, no explanation. Just those words next to a string of genetic data I didn't understand. I searched every line of the dump again, digging deeper into the vessel terminology. The documents weren't just medical, they were legal, philosophical, and oddly clinical in tone. One file contained transcripts from what appeared to be internal planning meetings. A woman, unnamed, spoke about biocontinuity as a right of the architect and how identity was a function of neurological mapping, not flesh. Another voice referred to a doctrine called the continuance mandate, a kind of manifesto hidden inside a legal framework. According to it, those who fund progress, architects of the next threshold, should not be limited by natural expiration. They had earned more than legacy, they deserved transference. There were diagrams too, primitive at first, then increasingly technical. Neural overlays, brain-to-brain interface scaffolds, something labeled continuity mapping.
Schema.
I found patent applications buried in old USPTO filings, rejected without public explanation, but still preserved in archived records. One described a synthetic synaptic bridge for post-consciousness transfer. Another referenced receptor, compatibility with youth-grade neural tissue. The language was chilling in its precision, but it wasn't until I accessed a set of video logs that the pieces really started to lock into place. The footage was grainy, time-stamped in 2004. A man in a white lab coat spoke to the camera in a flat voice. Vessel Protocol Phase 1 results. Confirm non-consensual mapping is viable during induced coma states. Subject 014 did not survive reawakening. Subject 015 achieved temporary partial continuity but was terminated due to signal drift. I felt nauseous. These weren't experiments, they were trials. Forced ones. I started to piece it together. The billionaires weren't dying, they were transferring. The deaths were scheduled. Their bodies were disposed of, yes, but not their minds, not their identities. And the donors, people like me, we were the vessels, chosen not randomly, but from a decades-old program of prenatal genome tracking. I hadn't been investigating them. I'd been circling a story they designed to bring me in. The address came from a watermark embedded in one of the scanned lab memos, barely visible, layered into the margins like a forgotten stamp. Site 9 Cayuga Facility. It took 2 days of cross-referencing decommissioned biotech campuses before I found it. Tucked in the Adirondacks, listed as a former vaccine R&D center, shut down after a merger in 2008. I rented a car under an alias and made the drive, snow still clinging to the trees despite it being late April. The road to the facility was unmarked, just a narrow gravel path leading to a rusted gate and a weathered sign half swallowed by vines. The building itself was squat and windowless, built into the slope like it was trying to hide. I parked down the hill and hiked the rest of the way, my recorder tucked in my coat pocket, every step louder than it should have been in the quiet. The lock was gone, the chain wrapped loosely, like someone wanted it to look secure, but didn't care if it held. Inside, the air was still and cold, with the faint scent of disinfectant that had outlasted the people who once used it. Most of the rooms were stripped, empty gurneys, overturned filing cabinets, shattered monitors, but in the sub-basement I found what they hadn't removed. Behind a false wall in a storage closet was a narrow stairwell leading to a level not listed on the fire maps. There were no lights, just emergency strips flickering every few feet. I followed the hallway to a single room sealed by a biometric reader, long dead, its casing split open. I pushed through. The room was intact. Rows of reclining chairs lined the space, each with a halo of wiring overhead, monitors, fluid ports, neural interface equipment that hadn't been touched in years. At the far end, a wall of lockers, most empty. but one still held the contents, a child's medical file, laminated and worn. My name was on the cover. Inside were growth charts, cognitive tests, and a logo I'd never seen before. 2 concentric circles, one inside the other. Underneath, compatibility confirmed, Tier 1. They hadn't just watched me, they'd been cultivating me. They hadn't just chosen me, they'd grown me. I didn't drive home. I left the car on a back road outside Utica, wiped it clean, and paid cash for a bus ticket back to the city. I knew enough now to understand they were probably tracking more than my devices. Whatever had started with that data dump, it had always been meant for me. And if I could find that facility, it meant they'd let me. The question was why. Back in my apartment, I packed only what mattered: encrypted drives, physical copies of the files I could print, and 3 disposable phones I'd kept for sources who didn't want to be remembered. I used the first to make one call to a contact at an independent medical ethics board, someone who'd once investigated illegal stem cell trials. I didn't give her details, just keywords: vessel protocol, Enoch Holdings, neural continuity. Her voice changed immediately. "I've heard whispers," she said, "but nothing concrete. Where did you get those names?" I told her we needed to meet in person. She agreed. We never got the chance. The next morning, I got a call from a blocked number, a man's voice, calm, measured. "Ms. Craig, we know you've accessed restricted archives and entered a facility marked for containment. You need to stop." I asked who he was. He didn't
Answer. Just repeated, "This is your warning." Then silence. That night, I noticed the light on my hallway camera blinking when it shouldn't. Someone had accessed my building's security system. I slept in the stairwell 2 floors down. When
I returned in the morning. Nothing had been taken, but someone had left something. A business card on my kitchen counter, no name, no number, just the same double ring symbol from the file cabinet at Site 9. I realized then I wasn't being warned to stop. I was being guided. They wanted me afraid but active. They wanted me closer, and I was playing along. I booked a ticket to DC under a false name, planning to leak what I had to a journalist friend at a global health NGO. But before I boarded the train, my friend messaged me, "Emergency travel, out of the country, stay safe." It came
from an iPhone. But she hated Apple, always used Android. The detail was small but deliberate. I never got on that train. I walked straight past the boarding gate, tossed the ticket into a trash bin, and disappeared into the crowd. By then, I understood this wasn't about staying ahead. It was about staying unpredictable.
I spent the night in a hotel under a name I hadn't used in years, sleeping in 30-minute increments, replaying every piece of the puzzle until it all started to make sense. The vessel protocol wasn't a project. It was a system. Decades old, built slowly and invisibly into institutions no one ever questions. Pediatric research grants, school aptitude programs, biometric testing initiatives disguised as public health studies. I wasn't selected as an adult. I was bred into this, groomed for compatibility. My childhood illnesses, the odd clinical trials my parents consented to without question, even the journalism grant I received in college, they weren't random. They were signposts, invisible ones, proof that I was being moved toward this outcome by hands I never saw. I checked the last name on the list from the compatibility log. It was someone I knew, a girl I'd gone to high school with who died in a car accident our senior year. I remembered the news, how sudden it was, how her body was never shown. In the memo beside her name was a single note. Phase 2, continuity successful. Integration was incomplete. It was the first time.
I cried, not for her, but because I finally understood what they were doing.
Consciousness wasn't being copied. It was being migrated. One life overwritten, another erased. The donors didn't survive. They were hollowed out, made vessels. I left the hotel at dawn, walking in circles for an hour before hailing a cab to the Novamera building. Part of me still wanted to run, but I knew it was too late for that. That part was over. I just wanted to look into the eyes of someone who had known all along. The receptionist greeted me by name before I spoke. She smiled too quickly, like she'd been told exactly when I'd arrive. "Welcome home, Emma," she said. Her voice wasn't familiar, but her eyes were. I'd seen them once in a photo of my mother taken before I was born. They didn't restrain me. No threats, no locked doors. Just a quiet invitation into a conference room with dim lights, white walls, and the low hum of machinery I couldn't place. A woman waited for me there. Early 60s, calm posture, expression unreadable. She introduced herself as Dr. Miriam Lairn. I recognized the name from one of the early memos listed as the lead architect of Continuity Phase 3. She didn't ask questions. She simply spoke as if this conversation had already happened, and I was just catching up. "The truth isn't what you found, Emma," she said. "It's what you are." She showed me a document, my medical file from birth through present day, embedded neural tracking, controlled cognitive scaffolding, behavioral modulation cues introduced through schooling, nutrition, and targeted digital content. Every choice you thought you made was part of a corridor we designed, she said. We guided the turns, you just didn't see them. I asked her why. She said it wasn't about who I was. It was about how well I could hold someone else. High emotional. Resilience, cognitive plasticity, zero familial history of degenerative disorders. She said I'd been viable from the start. But I wasn't the destination. I was a backup, a contingency. The real vessel had failed. And now time was short. "You'll still be here," she said gently, "just beneath the surface."
The part of you that listens, that questions, it gives depth to the host. You won't be erased, Emma. You'll be absorbed.
I told her no, that I'd expose them, publish everything, but she didn't flinch. She just handed me a file and walked out. No guards, no warnings, just that file. Inside was a scan of a brain, mine, next to another, nearly identical, but older. The match was 99.8%. It belonged to her, Dr. Miriam Lairn. She wasn't asking to use me, she was asking to come home. I didn't go public. I never wrote the story, because something changed after that meeting. My thoughts slowed. My memories grew soft at the edges. And sometimes when I speak, it's not my voice I hear. I'm still here, but I'm not alone. And when I look in the mirror, I see her smile. I don't know whose reflection it is anymore. Before we go deeper, take a moment, like this video if you haven't yet, Subscribe to stay close to the truth and tell us in the comments, do you believe the system hides more than it reveals? We're listening, and so might they. They told us the Mariana Trench was the most unexplored place on Earth. That was a lie. It wasn't unexplored, it was avoided. For most of my career, I thought I was chasing silence. Deep-sea acoustics aren't glamorous, just sonar pings, whale calls, tectonic murmurs. I liked it that way. Predictable, clean. I had a small lab funded by a marine institute in Tokyo and a quiet apartment above a bookstore in Naha. My name is Dr. Sarah Lockhart. I've spent the last 18 years decoding the language of the ocean. And then one morning, the silence changed. It began with a signal. Not a distress beacon or a vessel's black box ping, but something rhythmic, deliberate. It came from Challenger Deep, the lowest point in the Mariana Trench. A tonal sequence repeating every 11 minutes, as if stitched together from subharmonic vibrations. It was subtle, buried beneath tectonic noise, almost masked by the natural chaos of the sea floor. But not random. I remember blinking at the waveform, thinking it looked scripted. When I ran it through our standard spectral filter, it split into layers, too organized for geological origin, too clean. I shared the anomaly with two colleagues, Mori, a technician, and Dr. Hoshino, a bioacoustician. Mori dismissed it as equipment feedback. Hoshino looked at me too long before saying, maybe it's volcanic. But we both knew better. There hadn't been seismic activity in that sector for months. 3 days later, a private foundation I'd never heard of, Maritech Holdings, contacted our lab. They had taken an interest in our data and offered funding. Full grants, new submersible tech, unrestricted dive time, no peer review required. Just a simple condition. All findings stay within the project team. It was sudden, generous, and oddly specific. I should have said no, but I was curious. Worse, I was bored. We deployed the new hydrophone array that week with Maritech's rep on site. A man who never gave a first name, only Derek. He didn't talk about science, only timelines. The day the array went live, the signal changed, not in pitch, but in structure. Now there were pauses, breaks, almost like breath. Derek called it progress. I didn't sleep that night. Something in me already knew. We weren't listening to the ocean, we were listening to someone in it. I started parsing the signal, frame by frame, isolating segments and matching them against known marine acoustic databases. Nothing came close. The frequency dips resembled baleen whale calls, but the structure, those recursive pulses, felt engineered. I spent entire nights in the lab alone, hunched over audio spectrograms, watching patterns fold into each other like origami. Every hour revealed something new. The pulse sequence wasn't just repeating, it was evolving. I compared our latest recording to the first transmission from 2 weeks earlier. The waveforms had shifted subtly, compressing time intervals and introducing harmonic distortions that almost mimicked language. Not Morse, not digital, something else. And then, deep in the spectrum tail, I found a fingerprint. It was faint, barely above the noise floor, but clearly artificial. A repeating vector array, like an identifier or signature embedded in the lowest tones. It looped every 66 minutes, always at the exact same nanosecond timestamp. I ran the pattern through our in-house machine learning classifier, and the output stopped me cold, possibly intentional encoding.
Unknown origin. When I confronted Derek, he didn't act surprised. He just said, now you're seeing it. I asked, who else was monitoring the signal? He replied, people who stopped believing in coincidences a long time ago. After
that, things accelerated. A data stream from a Maritech satellite link started syncing with our lab server. Every evening at 2:14 a.m., compressed files would auto-download into a locked folder labeled Project Harrow. The files were encrypted, but I caught a file name in the sync log, Aqua Archive 1279 TPL. I recognized the extension. TPL was a format used by a templating language discontinued in the early 2000s, mostly by defense contractors. That wasn't marine science, that was military. I brought it up during a project review call. Derek muted his mic for a full minute, then came back with a question that caught me off guard. Do you know what happened in the trench in 1987? I didn't. I'd never heard of any incident that year. When I searched the marine seismic
logs, there was a data gap, an entire month missing from the public archive. Gone like it never existed. That's when I realized this wasn't research. It was surveillance. The signal we'd discovered wasn't new. We were just the first ones naive enough to notice it publicly. And now we were being fed curated data.
Carefully timed, as if someone wanted us to uncover the truth in stages, not too fast, not too slow. I stopped calling it a signal after that. It wasn't a message, it was a lure. I didn't sleep for 2 days after decrypting the first Harrow file. It wasn't just data, it was a reconstruction, bathymetric maps, sonar scans, heat signatures, and a 3D render of something enormous sitting deep within the trench wall. Not a shipwreck or rock formation, but a structure. Symmetrical, hollow, engineered. The render showed smooth vertical struts and tiered platforms, all encased in mineral growth, consistent with centuries of submersion. The report was dated 1994 and signed by a name I recognized only because it was scratched out in pencil in one of the old hydrophone logs, M. Valen. I couldn't find a record of him in any academic directory, but Maritech's personnel access logs had a badge entry for that name, granted only once, for a dive registered off Palau under diplomatic clearance. I started pulling historical bathymetric data from international sources, anything public from before the digital migration in the late 90s. I found a partial seafloor map from a French expedition in 1972 that showed a distortion in the same area. At the time, it had been marked as a sonar anomaly and dismissed. But when I overlaid it with the Harrow render, the match was almost perfect. This structure, this facility, had been sitting down there quietly absorbing sediment and sonar, pings for over half a century, maybe longer. I kept digging. A retired geophysicist in Spain, once part of NATO's Atlantic mapping project, agreed to a video call. When I showed him the signal waveform, his face went pale. "We heard that in 1983, he said quietly. Classified the recording and shut the array down, thought it was a Soviet thing. I asked if he'd heard of Maritech. He didn't answer. He just ended the call. That night, I went back through the ITL archive. One file was a scanned, handwritten log dated 1691, written in Old French. The ink was faded, but legible enough. It described a voyage launched from La Rochelle under the banner of a Templar splinter group fleeing Vatican prosecution. The captain referred to a new Jerusalem beneath the deep and described following the fire songs of the sea. Coordinates listed in the margin matched the edge of the trench. I stared at the paper for what felt like hours. If the dates were accurate, someone had been building, or at least seeking, something down there since the 17th century. And if the Templars survived longer than history recorded, retreating not into the hills or foreign lands but beneath the ocean, then this wasn't lost knowledge. It was protected knowledge, cultivated, preserved, waiting. I started to understand the magnitude of what I'd found, not just a structure, but a society hidden in the last place anyone would look, shaping the seabed and shielding their work, with centuries of silence. And now, for reasons I didn't yet grasp, they were ready to be heard. The descent felt ordinary at first. The Maritech submersible, fitted with reinforced plating and custom sonar dampeners, dropped into the trench with practiced ease. But once we passed 7,000 meters, the world changed. Light from the upper ocean vanished entirely, and even the familiar pings of our scanning system returned warped and scattered, like sound bouncing through glass. I watched the monitors carefully, noting how certain readings froze intermittently, not malfunctioning, but pausing, as if something below us was interfering with the data. We reached the seabed at 10,902 meters, directly above the coordinates from the 1691 log. The moment the landing struts touched silt, our forward camera revealed it. The structure wasn't just there, it had been exposed. A partial collapse in the trench wall, likely triggered by tectonic movement, had revealed an entryway, a narrow, sloped corridor lined with hexagonal plating that shimmered with mineral deposits. Derek, seated beside me, didn't speak. Ikea just nodded and tapped the comm. Proceed. We launched the crawler drone, watching it slip into the opening, its floodlights catching impossible angles and unnatural precision. The floor was smooth, no coral, no sediment, just dark, polished panels that seemed to absorb light. Symbols lined the walls, etched deep and precise, identical to those from the Templar manuscript. At first they looked ornamental, but when the crawler passed through a second chamber, the markings shifted in formation, adjusting slightly as though in response to the drone's presence. We stopped the feed. I asked Derek if the system was glitching. He shook his head. It's reacting. We followed in the main sub, sealing pressure hatches behind us as we entered the structure. The airlock, yes, an actual working airlock at the bottom of the ocean, sealed tight, and pressure equalized automatically. When the inner door opened, we stepped into a chamber unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was dry, silent, and warm. Not just warmer than outside, but precisely regulated. The room held no controls, no visible vents or power systems, just an altar-like platform in the center, and around it, walls lined with murals, each depicting human figures dressed in medieval armor, their faces blank, eyes upturned toward a symbol hovering above them. The same three-circle emblem I had traced weeks earlier. It wasn't just a structure. It was a temple, a memory, a record of survival, or perhaps a warning. Derek moved with purpose, as if he had seen all this before. He approached the altar and pulled from his suit a small object I hadn't seen him carry, a pendant shaped like the symbol on the wall. He placed it in a slot carved into the stone, and the room responded. A low hum built from the floor, deep and tonal, vibrating the soles of my boots. Then the murals changed. The figures looked up, not in worship, but in preparation. Their hands reached toward machines, ancient and yet impossibly advanced. And beneath them, etched in Latin, a phrase that chilled me more than the pressure outside ever could. Sub mare libertas, post mare judicium. Beneath the sea, freedom. Beyond the sea, judgment. I turned to Derek, but he wasn't looking at the mural. He was staring into the darkness ahead, where a second doorway had just opened. The second doorway led us into a long corridor carved from a material I couldn't immediately identify, smooth as glass but warm to the touch, pulsing faintly with a dim blue glow from within its walls. We moved cautiously, the air oddly breathable, the silence complete. No hum of systems, no echo from our footsteps. It felt like walking through the inside of a lung that had forgotten how to breathe. As we moved deeper, I began to notice the corridor subtly sloped downward, curving with the shape of the trench wall. Embedded in the walls were panels displaying sequences of numbers, old star charts and tectonic overlays. An interface maybe, but one not made for human hands. I stopped at a cluster of symbols that matched fragments I'd seen in the pulse, signal weeks earlier. They weren't just decorative, they were timestamps. Each sequence corresponded to major seismic events across history: Lisbon, Krakatoa, Sumatra, Fukushima, all matched to previous signal flares recorded in global archives but never connected. It hit me then, the Aquarians hadn't been hiding from humanity. They'd been shaping it. Each event, each natural disaster, a recalibration, a test, or worse, a correction. I turned to Derek, asking the question out loud for the first time. Is this why we're really here? To stop them? He didn't answer, just stared ahead, jaw set, eyes fixed on the dark chamber up ahead, where another glow was growing brighter with each step. That night, back aboard the research vessel, I tried to upload a copy of the chamber data to an encrypted drive I'd hidden among my equipment. The file froze halfway. Moments later, my terminal locked. System override. Unauthorized transmission detected. A minute after that, the door to my cabin slid open and 2 Maritech security staff entered without knocking. They didn't touch me, didn't speak. Just handed me a paper envelope sealed in wax with the same 3-ring emblem I'd seen in the temple. Inside was a single sheet of instructions. Cease external communications. Remain compliant. No further. Warnings. I was being watched. Every note I'd taken, every frame I'd captured, already monitored. I stared at the words for a long time before folding them back into the envelope and placing it in my bag. I realized then I had a choice. I could bury this, let it sink into the depths like every other unexplained anomaly. Or I could surface with the truth and take whatever came with it. I lay awake, listening to the groan of the hull as the ship shifted against the tide, wondering how many other researchers had come this far and vanished quietly. The pressure to stay silent was immense, but so was the knowledge of what that silence would cost. The Aquarians had waited centuries beneath the waves. They weren't going to stop now. And the deeper we went, the more it became clear. They were ready. The only question was whether we were. We returned to the structure the next morning under heavy supervision. No drone feeds, no backups, just a live tether to the Maritech uplink and 2 new security personnel shadowing every movement. Derek led us beyond the second chamber, through a narrow passage that widened into a vast, domed space unlike anything we had seen. The architecture shifted here, less symmetrical, more organic. Walls arched overhead in fluid curves, surfaces, veined with glowing filaments that pulsed in rhythm with our footsteps, as if the space itself responded to presence. In the center stood a circular dais surrounded by concentric rings carved into the floor, each etched with more of the Templar symbols and mathematical notations I recognized from our earlier data. Only now they formed a complete sequence, a closed loop. Derek stepped onto the platform without hesitation and placed his hand over a smooth depression in the stone. A low vibration filled the chamber, and something deep within the walls began to shift. The ceiling above us opened in layers, revealing an immense vertical shaft that disappeared into the darkness above, and from that darkness descended a mechanism, a sphere of polished black metal inscribed with the same 3-circle emblem, suspended without visible support. Lights along the chamber flickered, our instruments failed simultaneously. No temperature readings, no radio signal, complete isolation. And then the sphere spoke. Not in sound, but through pressure. A wave
of resonance passed through us, low and heavy, not painful but inescapable.
My vision blurred as images flooded my mind, cities collapsing into the sea, vaults opening beneath deserts, towers of light piercing storm clouds. I saw the earth not as it is, but as it had been shaped, molded over centuries by forces disguised as nature. The Aquarians were not guardians of lost knowledge. They were its architects, custodians of balance, and they had not chosen us to find them. We had triggered an assessment. The signal, the seismic anomalies, the encoded transmissions, they were diagnostics. Earth was being evaluated for stability. Every major quake, every sudden shift wasn't random. They had been testing the crust, the coastlines, and the polar, magnetics, and by whatever standard they used, we had failed. When I regained focus, Derek was on his knees, staring at the sphere with tears streaming down his face. He looked at me with something between awe and fear and whispered, "They're going to reset it. All of it. The plates, the currents, the biosphere, like scrubbing a map before redrawing it." He said the words like he'd rehearsed them. A soft chime echoed across the chamber, and the sphere rose silently, retracting into the shaft. The lights dimmed, the platform powered down. It was over. The message had been delivered. Back on the surface, Maritech sealed the data. We were debriefed separately, our logs erased, our credentials locked. Officially, the dive never happened. Derek was reassigned to a classified Arctic operation. I was offered a teaching position at a university in Norway, far from the Pacific, far from anyone who might ask questions. I accepted. I didn't see another team member again. But every night I checked the seismic feeds, and every night At precisely 3:11 a.m., I see it. The same harmonic pulse repeating, softer now, but still present. Not a warning, a countdown. I moved to the Norwegian coast in early spring, when the snow still clings to the fields and the sea feels older than time. The university was quiet, the kind of place where no one asks too many questions, where a researcher with faded credentials and tired eyes can disappear into lectures and tide charts. I told myself the move was a fresh start, but that wasn't true. It was containment, a controlled burn to keep the fire from spreading. I kept my reports hidden on a drive buried beneath books in a drawer no one ever opens, but I stopped reviewing them. I already knew too much, and knowing hadn't helped. In fact, it had taken everything. My name no longer appears in published papers. My Maritech profile was deleted. Most of my colleagues think I burned out. A few assume I was quietly dismissed. No one asks directly. That's how this kind of story ends, not with confrontation, but with erasure. Still, I can't forget what I saw. The chamber, the sphere. The way Derek's voice trembled when he said the world would be reset. Every time I hear the creak of sea ice breaking offshore, I wonder if something beneath it is listening. The pulse hasn't stopped. It's weaker now, more diffuse, but still there, like a memory etched into the ocean floor. I track it through public seismic nodes, masked behind tectonic drift and undersea currents, but once you've heard it clearly, you know how to find it. And lately it's been spreading. Signals from deep fault zones off Chile, fragments picked up in Arctic trenches. The pattern isn't fading, it's replicating. 2 nights ago, the Norwegian Seismic Authority logged a microquake just off the Lofoten Shelf. Nothing unusual except for one thing. The waveform carried a harmonic signature I hadn't seen since the trench. I stayed up all night watching it. It was short, almost like a test signal, as if something beneath the North Atlantic had switched on and was waiting to be heard. I used to think we'd discovered something ancient, but now I believe it discovered us. We were the anomaly, the imbalance in a system that had been quietly self-correcting for centuries. The Aquarians, whoever they are, didn't abandon the world. They restructured it from below. They watched our wars, our technology, our failures. And now, with seismic alignment approaching and oceanic shifts accelerating, I believe they've made their decision. I left a sealed letter with the university registrar. If anything happens, to me it gets mailed to 5 people who won't believe it, but who might look anyway. Not to save anything, just to know, because once you hear the signal, you can never unhear it. The sea no longer feels silent to me. It never was. It was just waiting. I was scrubbing background noise from a political podcast when I first heard the signal. A tone no one else could hear, buried under the host's voice like a whisper, meant for someone else. Most days, my job was as dull as you'd imagine. Compress, clean, and normalize audio until it sounds like everyone else's podcast, polished, unnoticeable. That's what people pay for. I worked alone out of a small studio apartment in West LA, the kind where every piece of furniture is also storage. Clients came from all over, YouTube channels, streaming platforms, a few government contracts I never asked too many questions about. But that morning, it was just me and a new episode of a political commentary show, the kind that gets 5 million downloads a week and says nothing new. I was halfway through cutting room tone when I noticed something off, not in the content but beneath it. There was a pattern under the noise floor. At first, I thought it was just digital artifacting, maybe interference from an old mic preamp. But when I zoomed in, isolated the frequency, and looped it, the hairs on my arms lifted. It wasn't random. It was structured. Ultra-low tones pulsing in sync with the rhythm of the host's speech, subtly shifting with his emotional cadence. I ran a spectral analysis out of curiosity. The pattern didn't belong in human speech. It sat well below the vocal range, below even the threshold of normal hearing. Infrasound, barely perceptible unless you knew what to look for. I marked it, saved it, and went on with my day, but I couldn't let it go. I started noticing it elsewhere. In a pop song on the radio, a car commercial, even the evening news, all different producers, different formats, but the same spectral anomaly. It wasn't loud, just persistent, like a heartbeat hiding inside the media. I didn't tell anyone. Who would care? Who would even believe me? Still, I started tagging. Every instance, building a folder on a drive, I didn't connect to the internet. Just in case, I told myself I was imagining things, a product of long nights and too much caffeine. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't a glitch. It was deliberate. I couldn't sleep that night. The infrasound looped in my head like a phantom signal, even though I'd shut down my gear hours earlier. The next morning, I ran a deeper analysis, cross-referencing the audio spectrum from the podcast with those other files I'd flagged. I wasn't looking for confirmation. I
already knew it was real. I was looking for intent.
One of the plugins I use for forensic filtering has a mode typically reserved for counter-surveillance, designed to detect ultrasonic beacons embedded in corporate ads. It lit up immediately. Same modulation rate, same carrier signal. That's when the pieces began to align. These weren't audio errors, they were injected with signatures. I traced the files back to their source and discovered something stranger. The embedded frequencies weren't present in the original studio recordings. They were introduced during distribution, added by the platforms themselves. Not just one platform either. I found traces in content hosted by multiple major media networks across music, podcasts, even some streaming video audio tracks. Every time, it was tucked just below the noise floor, perfectly engineered to go unnoticed. I compiled a spreadsheet, tagging each by timestamp, frequency range, emotional tone of the content, and geographic metadata where available. A pattern emerged, not random at all. Content promoting fear or outrage carried one frequency set. Content meant to reassure or distract had another. Like a language spoken in sound most people couldn't hear. I'd heard of subliminal messaging before, but this wasn't that. This was something cleaner, more mechanical, surgical almost. It didn't try to convince you of anything. It just made you feel. And it was everywhere. I uploaded a few of the audio files to a private server I kept offline for safety. Not paranoia, just habit. Then I searched for anyone else who might have seen what I was seeing. Forums, old mailing lists, deep threads in buried corners of the web. Nothing current. But eventually I found a post from 2014 on an archived acoustics board written by someone calling it themselves QO Tech. It was short, vague, but precise in a way only someone with real expertise would bother with. Infrasync patterns in public media, low cycle modulation linked to altered retention scores, who's testing the test? That last line stuck with me. Who's testing the test? I clicked on the username, hoping for a profile, but it was long deleted. Only one reply on the thread. You're hearing them too? The name QO Tech rattled around in my head for days. I couldn't find anything else linked to it. No profiles, no digital footprint, just that one post, archived in a forgotten corner of the internet. Whoever they were, they knew something, and they'd gone quiet. But that phrase, altered retention scores, sent me down a new path. I remembered a paper I'd read in college, buried in a sound design elective, about the psychological effects of sustained infrasound exposure. Back then, it was theory. Low-frequency waves used to manipulate emotional response. Lower resistance create a heightened state of suggestibility. I dug through online journals and their FOIA-requested documents and found something chilling, a declassified research study from 1998 conducted under the guise of acoustic crowd control. It mentioned a project codenamed Quiet Order Initiative. The language was academic, sanitized, but the implications were clear. Controlled soundscapes used in enclosed public spaces to guide mood and attention. The tests included shopping, malls, transport terminals, and, most notably, live broadcast environments. I stared at the scanned document for an hour, rereading the same line. Emotional compliance increased by 13% when exposure occurred below conscious awareness. The findings had been labelled non-actionable and shelved, but the names of the private contractors involved? One matched a media infrastructure firm I'd worked with last year on a freelance project, a defence contractor posing as a content delivery network. I went back through my old invoices and found the job, a simple audio normalization task for a government-backed educational channel. But now I remembered something odd. They'd requested I not touch the low-frequency range. Leave anything under 50 Hz as is, the note had said. At the time, I assumed it was some outdated tech requirement. Now I wasn't so sure. I tried reaching out to an old colleague who used to subcontract with them. His number was disconnected. Email bounced. I found his LinkedIn page, but it hadn't been updated in over a year. When I searched his name in public records, the most recent entry was a change of address form from 9 months ago. After that, nothing. I stared at the screen, the silence of my apartment pressing in around me. This wasn't just a rogue experiment or academic relic. It was still happening, and the more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Someone was refining a system, not just to influence what we thought, but how we felt while thinking it. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just packed a field recorder, my old laptop, and a second-hand EM mic with a steel chassis, then drove 4 hours north to a facility I hadn't thought about in years. It used to be a satellite broadcast relay station, one of hundreds that quietly fed television and radio signals across the country. This one, tucked into the forest behind a defunct paper mill, had been decommissioned in 2012, officially. I knew it was still drawing power because a friend in utility mapping once
showed me its active grid signature, steady, low usage, just enough to keep something alive.
When I got there, the perimeter fence was rusted and sagging. The padlock on the gate snapped off like someone had done it long before me. I stepped inside and felt the air change. It was cold in a way that didn't match the weather. The building was low and rectangular, covered in old satellite dishes like barnacles on a sunken ship. Inside, the place smelled of dust and metal. The main relay room had rows of equipment covered in tarps, but when I peeled one back, the panel underneath was spotless, cleaner than the rest of the room by years. A humming sound came from deeper inside, faint, rhythmic, faint enough to question, but steady enough not to ignore. I followed it. The hallway beyond was dark, lined with disconnected server racks. At the end, I found a steel door propped open with a piece of wood. The air beyond it was cooler still. A single light buzzed in the center of the ceiling, flickering. The room was empty, except for one thing, a small console, the kind used to test signal strength and feed quality. Its screen was on, active, lines of frequency data scrolled vertically in green text. I connected my recorder to the test output port, hit record, and watched the waveforms rise. The same pattern, the same frequencies, still broadcasting. I sat there in the dark, listening through my monitor headphones. There was no voice, no message. Just pulsing tones that shifted subtly every few seconds. It felt alive, reactive, like it knew I was there. Then I noticed something else, a blinking light above the console labeled Remote Monitoring Enabled. I wasn't just recording the signal, someone was watching me record it. I left the facility before sunset, heart pounding and jaw tight, convinced I was being watched. I didn't take the highway home. I turned off my phone, pulled the battery from my car's GPS unit, and drove for hours through side roads and small towns, stopping twice just to see if anyone was following.
No one was, but the feeling didn't leave. When I got back to the apartment, I didn't go inside. I parked 3 blocks away, walked past twice, checking for anything out of place. A black sedan idling too long, a neighbour I didn't recognise.
Nothing. Still I entered through the fire escape, kept the lights off, and slid the recorder out of my bag with shaking hands. I played back the signal I'd captured, watching the waveform shift in subtle ways. It was the same pattern, but with a new modulation, more dynamic, more precise, like a response. My hands trembled as I backed up the file to an encrypted drive. Then I wrote a report, technical, clinical, free of emotion. I detailed what I found, where I found it, and how it connects. I didn't name the quiet order directly. I still hadn't confirmed they were real, but I wrote the memo as if someone else would find it after I disappeared. Then I uploaded a redacted version to a secure Dropbox I'd used once years ago, back when a friend of mine leaked evidence of illegal biometric tracking by a defense contractor. He disappeared 2 weeks later. The next morning, someone knocked on my door. 3 quick taps, followed by silence. I didn't move. After a minute, an envelope slid under the door. Inside was a USB drive. No label, no note. I ran it on an isolated machine with the network card physically removed. The contents were simple, 4 audio files and a single document titled Subject 9 Behavioral Variants. The document read like a lab report, detailed logs of my online activity, sleep schedule, browsing patterns, emotional markers correlated with timestamps from the media I'd consumed. They had been watching me for months, possibly longer. I wasn't exposing anything. I was part of it. A line in the document chilled me to the bone. Do not interfere. Let Subject 9 continue. Valuable for adaptive modeling. They wanted me to keep going. This wasn't surveillance. It was a test. It hit me in waves. First disbelief, then dread. I wasn't unraveling a conspiracy. I was participating in it. Willingly. The more I reviewed the document, the clearer it became. I had been profiled, studied, even triggered. The discoveries I made, the patterns I followed, they weren't mine. They were planted, nudged, into place with surgical precision. The podcasts, the songs, even the old forum post from QO Tech. It was all part of their experiment, a closed system with me at the center. Every step I thought I took on my own had been anticipated, documented, and modeled. And the worst part? I hadn't noticed. I scoured the files again, desperate for any reference to who was behind it. The Quiet Order was never mentioned by name, but the term Q group appeared multiple times in the metadata, always in connection with something called the Amplitude Protocol. One file, dated just days before my visit to the abandoned relay station, included a psychological profile, mine. It listed my vulnerabilities with clinical detachment. Isolation tolerance high. Pattern recognition is strong. Paranoia threshold moderate. Subject shows resistance to direct manipulation, but responds favorably to layered emotional cues. That line looped in my mind like a warning wrapped in flattery. They knew exactly how I'd react, which meant even now my fear, my anger, it was data. I disconnected every device in my apartment, pulled the battery from my laptop, wrapped the recorder in foil and buried it in the freezer, just for the symbolism. But the real damage was already done. My mind wasn't my own anymore. I couldn't trust what I noticed, what I ignored, even what I felt. That night, I heard the frequency without any equipment. No speakers, no signal, just a low, pulsing hum that settled behind my eyes and refused to fade. It made me nauseous, disoriented. I collapsed on the floor, palms pressed against my ears, but it didn't help. There was no sound, just sensation, a pressure on my thoughts. Then it just
Stopped. Not silence, calm.
a wave of clarity so unnatural it scared me more than the panic. I knew what they wanted. They weren't testing if mind control worked. They were testing how long it would take before the subject knew it was happening and kept going anyway. I left the city 2 days later. Not out of panic, but resignation. Whatever part of me had believed I was still in control had eroded. I packed only what mattered, a hard drive with the audio files, a small recorder, and a notebook filled with
handwritten logs I no longer trusted.
the rest I left behind. My apartment, my clients, even my name. I drove north until the air smelled clean again, found a cabin with no cell service, and a wood stove that groaned when it settled at night. That's where I've stayed, off-grid, mostly. No streaming, no broadcasts, no frequencies I don't invite in. The silence here is different. It's not empty, it listens. And sometimes it speaks, I still hear it, the hum. Not always, not like before, but enough to know it never left. I've learned to live with it, to track its fluctuations like changes in weather. Some days it recedes, a faint vibration at the edge of perception. Other days it comes roaring back, subtle but overwhelming, woven into my thoughts like an unfinished sentence. I don't record it anymore. I stopped trying to prove anything. That part of me is gone. It's not about
exposing them anymore.
It's about understanding what I let happen to me. I was never the whistleblower I imagined. I was a mirror they held up to themselves, a data point in a much larger pattern. I don't know how many others there are. People like me who thought they were uncovering something only to realize they'd been fed the evidence one breadcrumb at a time. But I know this, the quiet order doesn't need secrecy. It needs belief. Not in them, but in ourselves, in our autonomy. And that's the trap. We think we're resisting, we think we're waking up. But every reaction, every suspicion, every attempt to warn the world feeds the model, I still write, but not to warn anyone. I write to remember who I was before the frequencies, before I became a case study, before I mistook surveillance for discovery. If you're hearing this, ask yourself one question: did you find this story, or did it find you? I was trained to report facts, but what if the facts themselves are a fiction written in ink older than history? I never intended to uncover anything, not like this. Most of my days were spent inside a climate-controlled newsroom, chasing political scandals and corruption cases that never went anywhere. My name's Ravi Patel, investigative journalist. I've made a decent career out of digging up skeletons in places where no one wanted to look, but always within the frame of what could be proven. That was the rule, until the files started arriving. At first, they were easy to dismiss, anonymous. Emails, PDF scans of old newspaper clippings, photocopied journal entries with no context. I assumed they were part of some crank's obsession with rewriting history. But then, one detail caught my eye. A blurred photo attached to an email with no subject line, showing a torn journal page dated 1919. In it, a man named Eli Patel described attending a closed-door gathering in the hills beyond Salzburg, where men in suits and robes discussed staging a controlled collapse of monarchic narrative. The name startled me. Patel. My name. It could have been a coincidence, but it didn't feel like one. I kept reading. The more I saw, the harder it was to shake the feeling that something was wrong with the way I'd been taught to see the world. Major turning points, wars, revolutions, economic crisis, seemed to echo strange internal phrases from these documents. Narrative adjustment protocol, cultural consolidation, Guardian edits. I'd heard conspiracy theories before, plenty. But this was different. These weren't wild claims shouted from the corners of the internet. These were patterns, methodical, coordinated, and chilling in their quiet confidence. They weren't trying to hide what they'd done, just betting that no one would believe it. I didn't tell my editor. I knew better. I told myself I'd look into it briefly, just enough to confirm it was all nonsense. But it didn't feel like nonsense. Not when my grandfather's name showed up on a shipping manifest dated 1946, one of 7 men listed as custodians of something called the Chronicle Ledger. Not when I found my own last name embedded in footnotes of restricted archives from post-war reconstruction councils. I didn't want this story, but it found me, and with it, the first shadow of something far bigger than I could yet understand. The first real lead came through a back-channel journalist forum, one I joined years ago under a pseudonym to keep tabs on obscure leaks and whistleblower chatter. A user going by HistEcho47 had been dropping cryptic messages for weeks, referencing hidden edits in educational archives and suppressed versions of declassified documents. Most of the forum wrote them off as another attention seeker, but I noticed something they didn't. Timestamps on the posts matched the update logs of a now-defunct government education database I'd once investigated for a story that never
ran. That wasn't a coincidence. I reached out privately, not expecting a reply, but I got one. Short, direct. You're looking in the right place. Don't trust what you think you know about 1947. Attached was a link to an archived curriculum.
Guide from that year used across dozens of US high schools. The document looked unremarkable until I ran a comparison against a local school copy from a small town in Vermont, where a retired history teacher had scanned her original 1947 materials for preservation. Line by line, the differences were staggering. Not just edits for clarity, but removals. Whole paragraphs about international advisory councils, civilian oversight bodies, even a reference to a Keepers Review Committee, gone without explanation. Something was being deliberately rewritten, and if it was happening in state-issued history books, I had to ask myself, how deep did it go? I traced the server location of the archival site. It routed through 3 mirrored domains before landing on a private server, registered in Luxembourg, under a shell foundation linked to an academic research group called Verdant Origins. The group had no public-facing staff list, but I found one press photo from a 2004 symposium, faded, poorly lit, but I recognized one face. Dr. Lenora Quinn. She'd been a guest lecturer at my university years ago, known for her work on mythological narratives in modern education. I remembered her not for her lectures, but because she once told me over coffee that the most dangerous lies are the ones told for comfort. I tracked her down. Her number was disconnected, no social media. Her university email bounced back. But after a few days of digging, I found a rental listing in New Haven under the same name. I left a message. The next day, someone slid a plain envelope under my apartment door. No note, no return address, just a USB drive and a single word typed on a sticky label, begin. The USB wasn't encrypted, but the contents were meticulously organized. 3 folders labeled Doctrine, Witness, and Bloodline. I opened Doctrine first. Inside were scanned pages from what appeared to be internal training manuals, but not for any organization I recognized. The pages described something called narrative stewardship, written in calm, clinical language. It outlined procedures for identifying emerging historical patterns, shaping them, and in some cases fabricating entirely new through lines to support public cohesion. The truth is elastic, one page read. Its primary function is not accuracy, but stability. The phrasing disturbed me, not because it was conspiratorial, but because it was rational, coldly rational. Witness contained recorded interviews. The files were old, digitized from what looked like analog tapes. One voice belonged to a man identified only as Subject 16. He spoke slowly, often pausing as if choosing his words with extreme care. We adjusted the timeline of the Bandung conference, he said in one file. The goal wasn't to lie, it was to prevent fragmentation. When the narrative fits, people don't question the frame. Another file was dated 1985. A woman, voice trembling, spoke of having altered first-hand testimonies about war crimes in exchange for economic recovery packages. We were told it was temporary, that the record would be restored in time, but it never was. It became the record. I sat for nearly an hour after that, not sure what to do with what I'd heard. Finally, I opened the last folder. Bloodliner. It held scanned birth records, letters, and a family tree dating back to the early 1800s. At the top, was the name Anik Patel. Underneath, dozens of branches spanning continents: India, Britain, Kenya, and then finally America. One of the scanned letters was addressed to EP, dated 1921. The signature was a name I recognized instantly from the earlier journal: Eli Patel. The letter described a gathering of men and women who believed that history, left unshaped, would collapse into chaos. They called themselves the Keepers. The letter ended with a sentence that struck me cold. If our descendants should ever forget what was sacrificed to protect the world from itself, may they at least inherit our resolve. I reread it twice, pulse rising. These weren't just conspirators. They were my ancestors, the very architects of the deception I was trying to expose. I wasn't just investigating the conspiracy, I was born from it. It was almost midnight when I parked outside the old textile mill in Lowell. The address had been buried in the metadata of one of the video files, a detail easy to miss unless you were looking for it. The building had been shut down since the war, 70s boarded windows and rusted signage marking its decline. But it wasn't the decay that unsettled me, it was the absence of graffiti. No vandalism, no broken bottles, no signs of curious teenagers. It was too clean in the wrong kind of way. I slipped through a side entrance pried open by time and neglect. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and machine oil, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes and settles in your lungs. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the dark, illuminating torn conveyor belts, rusted spools, and stairwells that vanished into shadow. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe I was hoping the place would be empty, that the breadcrumb was a dead end. It wasn't. Near the back, behind what used to be an office, I found a locked steel door with a biometrics scanner long out of use. The panel was dead, but the hinges had been cut clean through. Someone had been here before me. Beyond it was a stairwell descending into concrete silence. I moved slowly, conscious of every creak in the steps, every echo of my breath. At the bottom was a storage room, walls lined with faded wooden crates. Most were empty. One wasn't. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper, were 5 bound volumes marked Chronicle A, B, C, and so on. Their covers were plain. No dates, no seals. I opened one and felt my chest tighten. Handwritten pages catalogued. Event modifications dating back to 1836. Changes in political alliances, manipulated election results, even corrected casualty counts. Everything logged with names, signatures, and a rationale. Maintains public confidence. Prevents ideological drift. Supports cohesion. The 5th volume was different. No ledger entries, just reflections, notes between keepers, doubts, disagreements. One entry read, "Have we protected the world or imprisoned it?" Another, signed with the same initials as the letter I'd found before, EP, asked, "And if the truth ever breaks through, will our descendants forgive us?" I closed the book with shaking hands. In that room, surrounded by physical proof of decades of manipulated history, I wasn't just a journalist anymore. I was a witness, and the silence around me felt suddenly watchful, as if the walls themselves remembered too much. I didn't go home after leaving the mill. I drove for hours, looping through back roads, switching highways twice, and ditching my phone at a rest stop just outside Albany. Paranoia hadn't crept in. It had arrived fully formed. Every movement felt tracked. every silence staged. When I finally stopped, it was at a roadside motel that barely met the definition. I paid in cash, used a fake name, and didn't turn the lights on. The Chronicle volumes were hidden beneath the floorboard of my rental car, but I kept one with me. I read it slowly, methodically, taking photos of each page with an old DSLR I'd stashed in my duffel years ago. Then I uploaded the images to an encrypted drive and sent them to 2 trusted contacts, both journalists known for never blinking at classified material. No context, just a message. If I go silent, publish and everything. Within an hour, my inbox pinged with 2 replies. One was cautious. The other was blunt. Do you know what this is? I wasn't sure anymore. I thought I was chasing a secret, but I stumbled onto a structure, a system, and systems don't fall quietly. That night, I saw the first sign that I'd been noticed. Parked across the lot was a black SUV, engine off, windows fogged by the cold. It hadn't been there when I checked in. It didn't move, didn't even idle. But the placement was too deliberate. I waited an hour, then stepped out to smoke a cigarette I didn't need, watching its silhouette from the edge of the balcony. Still no movement. But when I went back inside, my laptop screen had shifted. The tabs I'd left open were closed. A new one was open. It showed a single phrase on a blank page. Your blood remembers. I shut the lid slowly, heart pounding. This wasn't a warning, it was a message. Not about what I'd found, but who I was. The keepers weren't just a historical artifact. They were current, active. And someone had gone through the trouble of reminding me that I wasn't just chasing them. I was born from them. I didn't sleep. I wrote instead. Not articles, not drafts. I wrote everything I knew, everything I'd seen. Every detail down to the grain of paper and the phrasing of ledger entries. I printed copies, mailed them to post office boxes I'd set up in 5 different cities during earlier investigations. It wasn't enough to know the truth. I
Had to outpace it.
Because whoever had broken into my laptop hadn't taken anything. They didn't need to. They already knew everything I knew, and they were letting me know very calmly that they were still in control. 3 days later, I met with one of my contacts in person, a former intelligence analyst named Claire, who now taught political ethics at a small college in Vermont. We spoke in code at a diner off Route 2, the kind of place where the coffee's burnt, and no one looks too long at anyone else. She had read the documents, all of them, and the look in her eyes wasn't skepticism, it was fear. This isn't a cover-up, she said quietly. It's a maintenance protocol. They don't hide history, they manage it. And they've been doing it for centuries. I asked her the question that had been building inside me since the mill. Is it still happening? Claire didn't answer with words. She handed me a folder. Inside were transcripts from a closed session of an international advisory panel dated just 8 months ago. The topic: Narrative Compliance Risks in Digital History Education. The language was eerily familiar, phrases lifted directly from the Chronicle volumes. Public confidence prioritization, event narrative synthesis, resonance corrections. There was a list of names too, people currently serving in global institutions, media boards, think tanks. One of them was a member of my publication's parent company. My stomach turned. I'd assumed I was uncovering a dead conspiracy, but this wasn't archaeology. It was a diagnosis. The patient wasn't dead, it was thriving. That night I published a redacted version of the first volume. No byline, no outlet. Just raw images and commentary uploaded to a secure site I knew couldn't be traced back to me. It spread fast, not viral, but deliberately. Passed from journalist to researcher to skeptic like a contagion. The response was mixed. Some called it a masterful hoax. Others took it as validation for every conspiracy they'd ever believed. But what unsettled me most were the emails I began receiving a few days later. Not threats. Invitations. We've read your work. We believe in stewardship. Would you consider joining the conversation? The addresses were private. The signatures are vague, but one stood out. It was signed LQ. I knew who it was. Dr. Lenora Quinn. She was alive, and she wasn't hiding anymore. The message wasn't confrontational. It was calm, even warm. You've seen the symptoms. Would you like to understand the cure? That night, I deleted the message. Then I rewrote it word for word into my notebook just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. I thought I'd feel triumphant when I published, but I felt hollow. The kind of ache that comes when you realize the truth doesn't set you free. It just redefines your prison. The world didn't collapse. The headlines didn't change, but I had. And now, everywhere I looked, I saw the scaffolding behind the story. Polished narratives, controlled tensions, neatly resolved crises. It was
all choreography. And the worst part was I understood why. Because once you know what chaos really looks like, the temptation to control the story becomes almost impossible to resist.
It's been 6 months since I walked away from my old life. No more newsroom. No more deadlines. Just silence. Broken only by the sound of my own questions. I live under a different name now, in a borrowed cabin near the edge of a lake that doesn't show up on most maps. The days are quiet and the nights are long enough to think. I keep the chronicle volumes hidden beneath a floorboard, wrapped in plastic and layered with cedar to mask their age. I haven't opened them since the night I ran. I don't need to. The pages are etched into my memory, every name, every edit, every justification. Sometimes I wonder if that's what they wanted, not to stop me, but to pass it on. The weight of the story isn't in the facts. It's in the knowledge that everything you once trusted was shaped by hands you'll never see. I used to think exposing the truth would be the hardest part. It wasn't. Living with it is. I hear from Claire sometimes. She's cautious now, off the grid more than on it. She told me last week that someone from Verdun Origins contacted her. No threats, just a message. The story was never yours, to tell alone. That's what haunts me, not the surveillance or the silence, but the calm, the complete absence of panic. It tells me this isn't disruption, it's continuity. The keepers are still out there, not hiding, but waiting, watching, offering membership to those who get too close to burning it all down. And maybe, in some twisted way, they think they're doing the right thing. That stability matters more than truth, that the world needs myths to stay intact. I've thought about publishing everything, all the names, all the ledgers. But deep down I know what that would unleash. Chaos, division, the kind that doesn't heal in a generation. Maybe that makes me a coward, or maybe it makes me one of them. Either way, I'm no longer sure where the line is. I tell myself I'll do it one day, when I'm ready, when it matters most. But that day keeps moving, just out of reach. So I write this instead, not for the public, not for my editors, but for whoever finds this after I'm gone. If you're reading this, you've probably seen the cracks too. You've asked the same questions, and maybe now you'll know what to do with the answers. Just remember this, history isn't broken, it's built that way. Wars don't happen anymore unless someone's buying both sides. That's what he said before he vanished. I used to believe in the mission. 20 years in intelligence makes you either loyal or lost, and I stayed loyal. For longer than Ashwant
I care to admit. But something about those final words stuck with me. They weren't dramatic or cryptic, just flat, like a warning I'd heard too late.
That man was Cole Vaughn, my old partner, and he knew things no one else did. The morning he disappeared, I found his apartment unlocked. No signs of struggle, no signs of anything actually, like it had been sanitized. On the table, one item remained untouched, a torn flight itinerary from Frankfurt to Ankara, circled twice in red. It wasn't a destination he'd mentioned, and it wasn't a route our office monitored. At the time, I was out. Retired early from field duty. Opted for an analyst slot in a contractor outpost in Brussels. A quieter life. No more missions, just metrics. My phone didn't ring much. That changed the next day. A number I hadn't seen in years lit up my screen. I let it go to voicemail, but whoever it was didn't leave a message. I don't know why, but I called back anyway. The voice on the other end said one word, initiative. Then the line went dead. I'm not one to chase ghosts, but that word, I'd heard it whispered during post-op debriefs, buried in redacted footnotes. Whispering Shadows Initiative. Supposedly a coordination cell. Multi-agency, off books. I thought it was just one of those internal myths we told ourselves when things didn't add up. A week after Cole disappeared, someone broke into my apartment. They didn't steal anything, just rifled through drawers, checked under rugs, opened the fridge. They weren't looking for valuables, they were looking for information, probably to make sure I hadn't found
something I wasn't supposed to.
That was the first time I felt it. Not fear, not yet. Just the sense that something had quietly shifted. Like a shadow was following me that hadn't been there before. I didn't have much left from my active days, just a hardened laptop I kept out of nostalgia and a few encrypted drives stored in a hollowed-out air vent. I dug them out that night, half expecting them to be empty or corrupted. But the files were intact, and more importantly, one of them contained a name I hadn't thought about in years, Project Bastion. It was listed on an old transport manifest, tagged alongside logistics data for conflict zones that never officially existed. Cole's name was there too as part of the clearance chain. That was enough to pull me back in. I isolated myself in a rented apartment in Lyon, under an alias I hadn't used since Macedonia. No phones, no networks. I booted the system on air-gapped, hardware, started mapping the digital traces left behind by Project Bastion. Most were dead ends, but then I found something, a metadata signature hidden inside a defunct Department of Defense press release. The document was just a standard casualty report from a drone strike in Sudan, but embedded in its file properties was a location ping and an IP address bouncing through 5 secure proxies. The last node pointed to a server in Montenegro, registered. to a shuttered logistics firm called Wexler Holdings. I cross-referenced Wexler with internal procurement lists and hit something that didn't make sense. Wexler had submitted bids for military contracts 3 years after it officially ceased operations. Someone was keeping it alive on paper to move money, large sums, across conflict zones in Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe. The digital trail led to a cluster of shell companies with no staff, no physical addresses, and no listed executives, except one, a man named Tobias Wren, a former signals analyst out of Langley who had disappeared in 2014 after a failed operation in Turkey. According to the official narrative, he'd burned out and vanished. But in the shadow world, people like Wren don't just disappear, they get repurposed. I dug deeper and found forum posts on encrypted message boards, threads discussing anomalous patterns in military funding, unit redeployments that didn't line up with public statements, even rumors of initiative-grade directives. It wasn't just a cabal manipulating intelligence data. This was structure, coordination. They weren't hiding chaos, they were engineering it. And at the center of it, like a keystone, was Whispering Shadows. Each link I uncovered made one thing clearer. Cole had been chasing something real, something dangerous, and someone wanted it buried. The name that finally cracked something open wasn't in a database. It was handwritten in the margin of an old requisition form scanned into a black site archive. Kestrel. No rank, no context, just that single word scrawled in blue ink beside an unusually large equipment shipment bound for an airbase in Djibouti. I ran the name through decommissioned call sign registries and stumbled across a file tagged as restricted under Joint Task 12. Kestrel wasn't a person, it was a node, a command and signal relay designed for autonomous wargaming simulations, except its routing logs showed real-world deployments, not exercises. One document referenced adaptive theater recalibration based on Kestrel feedback, and another noted predictive conflict shaping, a term I'd only ever heard whispered during contingency planning sessions that were supposed to be hypothetical. These weren't simulations, they were directives. Kestrel was feeding battlefield intelligence into an unknown decision framework, and those outputs were triggering real troop movements, black ops raids, and targeted destabilizations across multiple regions. The deeper I went, the more connections I found to conflicts I'd lived through, places I thought were accidents of history. But the patterns were too tight, conflicts erupting within weeks of economic downturns or legislative pushes on defense, spending, almost as if war was being used to preempt political or financial decline. My hands started shaking the moment I opened an unindexed video file buried inside a drone telemetry folder. It was low-res, time-stamped July 8, 2019, a forward operating base outside Erbil. The camera pans to a group of officials disembarking from an unmarked chopper. One of them is Julia Hartley, former Assistant Director of Intelligence Strategy, declared dead in 2020 in an off-the-record operation gone wrong. But there she was, alive, handing off a sealed case to a man I now recognized, Tobias Wren. The metadata on the video showed it had been accessed only once before, by Cole. That sealed it. This wasn't just about corruption, it was about continuity. The Whispering Shadows initiative wasn't manipulating foreign theaters for profit. It was constructing a self-sustaining cycle of war designed to keep the machinery running at all costs. and Cole must have gotten too close to the system's core. The one rule in intelligence is simple: never be the second person to see something. Dangerous. I'd just made myself the second. I arrived at the compound just after midnight, 2 hours outside Sarajevo, hidden behind a rusted checkpoint and a line of skeletal trees. The place had once been a NATO storage depot, decommissioned in the early 2000s and forgotten by design. I chose it because Cole had flagged it in a dead-drop note buried in the source code of a corrupted satellite image. A set of coordinates embedded in pixel data, classic tradecraft. Inside, the main structure was gutted, concrete walls lined with cracked insulation, the floors littered with dust-coated circuit boards and shredded paper that looked like someone had tried to erase the past by hand, but someone had come back. The outer room was cold and empty, but the inner chamber had power. Faint light still flickering from a single monitor propped up on an old radio desk. It was connected to a server rack that shouldn't have been operational, yet there it was, humming low, like it was waiting for someone to listen. I keyed in Cole's fallback passphrase, an obscure lyric from a 1978 folk song we used as an inside joke. The screen blinked, then loaded a nested directory. Ghost.
Ledger.
Inside were wargame logs, procurement contracts, and operation files with sanitized titles like Cascade Shift and Vector Echo. But the last folder hit differently. Control Doctrine. I opened it and found a full briefing packet, internal, documentation outlining how the Whispering Shadows Initiative maintained long-term conflict stability. Not through ideology or insurgency, but through controlled feedback loops. Military aid timed to sustain proxy wars. Disinformation seeded to prolong civil unrest. Election interference not for one side, but for balance. It wasn't about victory. It was about maintaining the conditions for endless tension. My stomach turned as I read a briefing signed by Julia Hartley herself, detailing a pilot operation in northern Africa that had resulted in over 12,000 civilian deaths, all predicted, all considered acceptable loss under phase-neutral metrics. I don't remember sitting down, but I found myself on the floor, cold seeping into my bones as the monitor's glow flickered across the walls. This wasn't a theory anymore. It was machinery, precise, clinical, and deeply embedded. I realized then why Cole chose this place. Not just to hide the truth, but to show me how invisible hands had shaped the world I thought I understood. I didn't sleep after what I found at the compound. Instead, I drove through the night, back roads only, no lights, no signals. By dawn I was in Zagreb, holed up in a flat I'd used once before during a border leak investigation. It was clean, cold, and off-grid. I made contact with 2 people I hadn't spoken to in years. Anton Simic, a former operations planner forced out after a whistleblowing attempt, and Rena Park, a surveillance specialist who vanished after exposing a cross-agency
audit tampering scheme. They didn't ask how I found them.
That's how this world works. If someone's knocking, it's either worth hearing or worth hiding from. I showed them the documents, the videos, and the briefing packet from Control Doctrine. Anton went pale. Rena didn't speak for a long time, just stared at the lines of code mapping conflict cycles as if she were reading a language only the initiated could understand. If this is real, she finally said, they won't let it breathe, not even for a second. We spent the next day laying groundwork, segmenting the files, preparing distribution routes, building timed packet drops across dormant networks we'd helped design years ago, but it was already too late. The first sign was Anton's phone, vibrating even though it had no SIM. He crushed it with a hammer. An hour later, a drone buzzed past the window, low, slow, not surveilling, signaling. That night, someone attempted access through a secondary back door we hadn't opened. Only one group had that level of access: internal counterintelligence, acting under executive carve-out. The initiative knew we were no longer researching, we were liabilities. Renner suggested a full blackout, disappear separately, come back up if and only if the leak held. But I couldn't do that. I had one contact left, someone inside the media space, high level, deep sources, with just enough protection to get something public before it vanished. I sent a message using a legacy signal path buried inside a disused NATO training server. One line: control doctrine, shadowproof, ready to move. Then I wiped the drive. The risk wasn't exposure. The risk was doubt. If even one person with reach believed me, it would be enough to fracture the silence. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to conviction. The meeting was set in Berlin, 3 levels beneath a decommissioned Cold War relay station. My contact went by the name Holden, a former intelligence liaison turned investigative producer with just enough clearance in his past to know when something was real. We met in a boiler, room converted into a secure shell. No phones, no wireless, only hardwired fiber routed through civilian utility lines. I handed over the drive, a clone of what I'd found at the compound, and watched his face as he skimmed the contents. He didn't flinch and didn't question the authenticity. He just said, "You'll never see daylight again if we move this." Raw. But he agreed it had to go out. We planned the drop, a limited release of key documents, buried inside a story about shell companies and defense contracting irregularities, just enough to spark inquiry without triggering an immediate shutdown. The rest would be held in reserve, with staggered releases if anything happened to me. I felt control slipping through my fingers even as we planned it. The initiative didn't need to erase everything. They just needed to inject enough noise to make the truth unrecognizable. The first breach happened 12 hours later. Anton was found dead in a safe house outside Osijek. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, just an empty room and a burned-out signal router. Renner vanished 2 days after that, her last message a single word typed into a dead channel. Compromised. I fled Berlin that night. It didn't matter where, somewhere without patterns, without routine. The story published 3 days later, just a sliver of the truth, wrapped in plausible deniability. Defense insiders called it unverified speculation, and within hours, the initiative's counter-narratives had flooded the space. Bots, op-eds, think tank rebuttals. It was a wall of silence disguised as noise. Holden tried to reach me after the broadcast, but I never answered. I was already gone, moving from place to place, watching the damage spread like smoke, visible but untouchable. I'd exposed them, but I hadn't broken them. And in trying to do so, I'd lost everyone who mattered. This wasn't justice. It was survival dressed up as purpose. The initiative wasn't a shadow government. It was a system, a culture of quiet decisions, profit-driven wars and engineered chaos, and now I was just another footnote in the data they'd already begun rewriting. It's been 6 months since the story broke, or rather, since it slipped into the noise and vanished beneath the next scandal, the next distraction, the next algorithmically amplified drama. No arrests were made, no inquiries launched. The few officials who blinked at the documents retracted their interest within days. One resigned, another accepted a board position with a defense contractor, rumored to be a front. I've moved 5 times since then, never staying longer than a week. The world sees a former operative with a stress disorder, maybe some unresolved delusions, quietly fading out of relevance. And maybe that's not entirely wrong. I dream differently now, not about the missions or the betrayals, but about silence. Clean, heavy silence, the kind that follows detonation, the kind that precedes a lie becoming permanent. Sometimes I imagine Cole sitting across from me, sipping bad coffee in a safe house that no longer exists, saying what he said that last time: if you can't stop it, mark it.
Leave a scar. I think that's what this was. Not a win, just a scar, a permanent anomaly in the data trail, a wound they can't fully close. That's what gives me a strange kind of peace. Not hope, they cured me of that, but the knowledge
that somewhere someone saw it. Someone noticed the pattern break. I've left fragments behind. Drives hidden in old network junctions. A printout mailed to a woman in Zurich who once decrypted a century's worth of trade codes just for sport. Nothing that can change the system, but enough to remind it that it's being watched too, because that's what the initiative fears most, not exposure, but scrutiny, not a leak, but persistence. I'm not a hero. I'm not a victim either. I'm a witness who got too close and then too far to go back. I've learned to live in the quiet, to move without expectation, to accept that the truth doesn't always bring light. Sometimes it just leaves shadows, but that's something. And in a world built on engineered forgetting, something is everything. Some truths survive by hiding in silence, buried not in time, but in intention. The first time I heard the name Athena's Vault, it was scribbled in the margin of a centuries-old field journal from a Greco-Roman excavation. I almost missed it. Just a faint line of ink, barely legible in the crumbling parchment. I was cataloguing artifacts at the Institute for Lost Histories, a position as dry and academic as it sounded. Most of my days were spent in climate-controlled silence, leafing through obscure records and cleaning clay shards no one would ever display. But that name, it struck me like a splinter, small, irritating, and impossible to ignore. The journal's author, a British explorer named Langford Bell, had died mysteriously in 1908, just days after returning from Alexandria. His notes were incomplete, fragmented by water damage and redacted sections. Still, something felt deliberate. His final entry described a passage beneath the ash, a phrase I'd never encountered in any official texts on the Great Library. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of excitement, but because it felt wrong, like I'd stumbled across a paragraph that was never meant to be read. By morning, I'd scanned the entry into the Institute's archives and submitted A quiet request for further materials connected to Bell's expedition. A week passed, then 2. Then a letter arrived, hand-delivered, unsigned, sealed in wax. Inside was a single microfiche slide labeled SOL, Index A, Restricted Holdings. I recognized the acronym instantly, Societas Obscura Librorum, Society of Librarians. It was a name whispered among historians like a fable, often dismissed as an academic ghost story. The idea that a secretive group of archivists had preserved forbidden manuscripts from the Library of Alexandria, safeguarding them across generations, wasn't just improbable, it was heretical to modern academia. But there it was, documented, real. I should have reported the slide. Instead, I reserved a microfiche reader after hours and loaded it alone. The contents were strange: diagrams, ciphers, references to texts I'd never seen before. Most curiously, an annotated floor plan of what looked like a cistern beneath the old Alexandrian ruins. It was as if someone had mapped a second library, one the world never knew existed. That was the moment the normal rhythm of my life shifted just slightly. Enough to feel it. Enough to make me follow. I spent the next week buried in metadata and satellite scans, avoiding questions by pretending to work on a paper I'd long abandoned. Every break between lectures and meetings became another excuse to dig into Bell's travels, piecing together a route from his notes and secondary sources. Most of his expedition records had vanished, either misplaced or quietly removed from public archives, but the few that remained pointed toward a coastal district near the modern Alexandria Library, just outside the tourist maps, where development had stalled for decades. Something about that area didn't match the city's otherwise rapid modernization. A blank spot, a pause in progress. That's where the breadcrumb trail led. With no direct access to restricted files, I turned to open-source archaeological databases and cross-referenced them with old maritime maps. A pattern emerged: survey. Anomalies, repeat sonar errors, site shutdowns attributed to soil instability. I found a photograph from a cancelled dig in 1986. A narrow shaft beneath a collapsed aqueduct, barely visible behind the scaffolding. At its base, a faint inscription. One word etched into stone. Not Latin, not Greek, but a character that matched, a glyph from the microfiche, a mirrored theta wrapped in a broken circle. I had seen it once before in a Vatican manuscript catalogued as indecipherable. I wasn't the first to notice. Deep in an online forum dedicated to historical cryptography, I found posts referencing the vault beneath fire and flood, a phrase nearly identical to Bell's note. The account had been active for only 6 months, and all posts ended abruptly 3 years ago. I messaged the admin, no reply. 2 days later, the entire thread disappeared. Not archived, not deleted, just gone, scrubbed. That night, I searched my own name online and found a blog post I'd never written, a 3-paragraph biography that placed me at conferences I'd never attended. Every detail is just close enough to feel real, but off. Wrong email, slightly different birth year. Even a photo that resembled me but wasn't. I sat in the dark, rereading it, feeling the chill of someone tracing my steps in reverse. It wasn't just history I was uncovering now. Someone was watching me uncover it, and they'd started to leave their own trail. There's a moment when research stops being academic and becomes personal, when the facts aren't just information anymore, but keys to something you feel deep in your chest. That moment came when I found the Concordia report. It wasn't easy to get. A former colleague from my postdoc days in Basel sent it over, encrypted, with no subject line. "Don't forward," was all the message said. The report had been buried since 1974, commissioned by a now-defunct arm of UNESCO after a series of unexplained collapses beneath Alexandria's eastern perimeter. Officially, it was classified as a geological risk study. In reality, it was an inventory of something else entirely. Sealed chambers detected by early ground-penetrating sonar, all aligned in a pattern no natural fault line could produce. 5. Locations, each marked with a symbol, nearly identical to the one from the microfiche slide. The team behind the study had proposed a joint excavation. Their funding was cut 6 weeks later. 3 researchers died in what the report called separate
incidents of natural causes.
I couldn't stop thinking about that phrase. It was clinical, tidy, like someone had made sure the story ended cleanly. I began cross-referencing the names from the report with academic publications, obituaries, anything that might explain who they were. One name kept appearing, Dr. Leila Khoury. She was a respected historian of Near Eastern civilizations, known for her work on early Hellenistic scripts. She also disappeared in 1976. No memorial, no public statement, just gone. But her last known paper, published 6 months prior, hinted at something profound. She referred to knowledge preserved in shadow, protected from empire, language, and time. That line shook me more than anything else. It wasn't poetic. It was precise. I found a digitized version of her notes buried in a private collection hosted by a university in Ankara. They contained hand-drawn diagrams of an unfamiliar script, glyphs similar to what I'd seen in the slide, and the aqueduct photo. The captions were spare, almost hesitant, but one phrase was circled in red ink: Societas Obscura Librorum. It wasn't a myth, it was real. And from the way Khoury wrote, it hadn't just survived history. It had shaped it. I arrived in Alexandria under the cover of a research grant, one that technically didn't exist. An old friend had helped me file the paperwork through an academic shell program, something used occasionally for fieldwork in sensitive regions. Officially, I was studying early aqueduct systems. Unofficially, I was following a decades-cold trail into a place no one wanted mentioned aloud. The entrance to the cistern wasn't where the records suggested. Urban development had swallowed much of the area, but one section remained oddly untouched. A derelict bathhouse fenced off behind a crumbling stone wall marked for demolition since 1993, yet somehow still standing. Local contractors avoided it. Too unstable, they said, full of bad footing and worse air. But the foundation plans told a different story. Below the bathhouse, 2 levels of subterranean architecture, undocumented in city records, but visible in the oldest topographic maps. I entered just before sunrise with a headlamp, a filtered mask, and a tablet loaded with every file I'd collected. The ground floor was exactly what I expected: decay, mold, silence. But the further I descended, the more the space changed. The brick gave way to smooth stone, curved corridors that didn't match Roman or Ottoman designs. At the lowest level, past a collapsed stairwell and through a rusted iron grate, I found it. A chamber roughly 15 meters across, partially collapsed on one side, but intact enough to show what it once was. The walls were lined with carved niches, and within them dozens of sealed vessels, scroll jars, though none I'd seen in any museum. On the far side of the chamber stood a monolithic stone panel, perfectly smooth, except for a single inscription in a language I still couldn't fully translate, but I recognized it. It matched the glyphs from the microfiche, and just below it, someone, recently, had etched a small modern message in English. If you open it, you cannot close it. I stood frozen for a long time, trying to decide whether the warning was a threat or a truth. There was no electricity, no security, no one watching. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the chamber had been expecting someone, and now it knew I had arrived. I left the chamber with more than just photographs. Inside one of the scroll jars, carefully wrapped in layers of dry cloth, was a manuscript unlike anything I'd encountered. The ink was intact, preserved by some compound I couldn't identify, and the script, though ancient, had clearly been annotated by multiple hands across different centuries. It wasn't a religious text or a political record. It was instructional, a coded primer on knowledge suppression techniques, psychological manipulation, and the controlled dissemination of truth through fabricated consensus. I didn't sleep that night. I scanned the manuscript page by page in a rented apartment under a flickering ceiling fan, encrypting the files twice and backing them up to a remote drive. The annotations referenced events that mirrored historical turning points, wars, scientific setbacks, institutional collapses, but were always framed
as deliberate rather than circumstantial.
I knew then why the society had stayed hidden for so long. They weren't just archivists, they were curators of power, guardians of truths so volatile they could unravel the legitimacy of nearly every system we rely on. By the following morning, I noticed the first signs that I was being followed. The same white sedan passed my apartment 3 times in an hour. The cafe, where I'd been a regular for a week, suddenly had new staff who asked the wrong questions, and my tablet, which had never connected to public networks, began showing signs of remote access attempts. I tried to act normal, keeping my movements casual, but a growing awareness followed me everywhere, as if I were now part of a script someone else had written. I considered reaching out to the press, to a university, even to a former mentor who once hinted at secrets he could never publish, but every option came with risk. What if I handed this knowledge to the wrong person? What if I exposed something no one was meant to see? That night I received an unmarked envelope under my door. No return address, no signature. Inside was a single piece of paper. It read, "You have one chance to disappear. Don't make our mistakes." I knew then that I wasn't the first to find the library. I was just the latest to ask the question no one wanted answered. What happens when the truth is too dangerous to be shared? I decided to leak only fragments at first. A few passages from the manuscript, translated and stripped of identifiers, posted to a private server I knew was monitored by intelligence historians and grey market archivists. Within hours, my access was revoked. By the next morning, the server was offline entirely. It wasn't subtle. Whoever had been watching had made their presence known. My phone went dead. My email credentials failed. Even my academic ID was flagged as unrecognized at the university gate. I had become a ghost without planning to. That's when the messages started, not official warnings but personal ones. Anonymous notes left at places I'd visited, sometimes quoting lines from the manuscript, sometimes asking questions I hadn't published. One read, "How much of history are you prepared to lose to tell the truth?" Another, "Would you choose collapse over silence?" The worst part was realizing they weren't threats, they were dilemmas. Society wasn't protecting knowledge because of its power alone. They were protecting the world from what people might do with it. The manuscript detailed ideological fractures seeded across centuries, technological discoveries buried to prevent destabilization, entire belief systems shaped by selective erasure. If released in full, the texts would invalidate foundational narratives in religion, science, and law. I tried to tell myself that exposure was worth the chaos, that the truth mattered more than the institutions built upon lies. But the deeper I went, the more I saw how fragile everything truly was. And then the breach happened. An independent researcher, someone I'd never contacted directly, managed to trace my server logs and recover an early version of the translation. He posted it publicly, only a few paragraphs, but enough. Within hours, media outlets began speculating. Not seriously, not yet. But the leak had left a scar. The society responded quietly, efficiently. The original post was discredited. The researcher vanished, not killed, just erased. His university denied ever employing him. His name was removed from journals. Online records collapsed. Even his family's public profiles went dark. It was a clean deletion. I understood then that there was no middle ground. Either the truth stays buried, or the world breaks trying to absorb it. And I, Elena Pierce, historian, academic, nobody, was the only one left holding the map to the fire. I didn't go home. I haven't been back since the day I left Alexandria. I burned the printed manuscript pages in a remote village in southern Crete, watched the flames consume history that was never meant to survive. The digital files were deleted too, not because I was threatened, but because I finally understood the burden of what they contained. The society never contacted me again. They didn't need to. Their message had already taken root. Some truths aren't buried. They're placed in vaults by those who understand their cost. I still carry a copy of one page, handwritten from memory, folded into a hollowed-out pocket in my jacket lining. I don't read it often, but when I do, I remember how it felt, standing in that stone chamber, surrounded by knowledge too dangerous to classify. I remember the pressure in my chest, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing. These days I live simply. I teach ancient languages under a different name in a city where no one asks questions about my past. I still trace patterns in floor. Mosaics still scan for glyphs in architecture, but always with the quiet understanding that I'm no longer a seeker. I'm a custodian. The world didn't change, not visibly. No wars erupted, no governments fell. But I see the signs, a shift in what's published, what's buried, a nervous energy in certain academic circles. It's subtle, like the tremor before a fault line gives. Maybe I didn't stop anything. Maybe I only delayed it. But sometimes that's enough. A pause, a breath, a chance for the world to choose caution over collapse. People ask why I disappeared. Why does someone with tenure and a rising reputation abandon everything? I don't have a good answer. Only this. History is a mirror we polish carefully until we forget the hand that shaped it. I saw what was behind the glass. I saw the vault, and I chose to close it. Some truths are too dangerous to lose, but even more dangerous to find. There's a room in the library basement no one admits exists, not in maps, not in budgets, not even in memory. But I found it, and everything changed. I'd been teaching philosophy at Elmsworth University for nearly 12 years. It was the kind of place where history clung to every hallway, where tradition outpaced progress, and where intellectual prestige carried more weight than practicality. My lectures covered continental theory, heavy material, abstract, often more
ritual than discussion.
I found comfort in the rhythms of academia, office hours, annotated books, chalk dust. That sense of structure cracked one Thursday morning during a seminar on Nietzsche. A student named Callum cited a passage I'd never seen, not misquoted, just different. The phrasing was sharper, stranger. When I asked for the source, he handed me a faded photocopy. No publisher, no author, only a partial Latin header and a worn library stamp marked Archives Sub-Level C. Elmsworth had no Sub-Level C, not officially. Later that afternoon, I asked the head librarian about it. She paused for half a second, just enough to notice, then dismissed it as a misfiled notation. Probably an outdated label, she said. That night I returned to the library. The staff elevator required a faculty card, and to my surprise mine worked for the lowest level. Beyond the basement stacks, through an unlit corridor, I found a narrow door without signage. Inside was a single room, bare walls, one table, and shelves behind glass. But in the back corner, behind a worn copy of Aquinas, I saw something carved directly into the stone, an obsidian black ring enclosing a vertical eye. I didn't know it yet, but that was the sigil of the Obsidian Order, and I had just entered their domain. I didn't return to the reading room for 3 days. I told myself it had been nothing, a curious symbol, an old stamp, but something about it stayed with me. I caught myself redrawing the ring and eye during lectures, thinking about it while grading papers. On Friday, I searched Elmsworth's faculty server, not for anything specific, just a name, a reference, anything connected to Sub-Level C. What I found instead were digital oddities in archived memos from the 1960s. Several PDFs included Latin fragments in tiny font at the bottom of the page, phrases that didn't match the document content. One of them referenced a text I'd never heard of, Portae Obscura, the Dark Gate. That title led nowhere in public databases, but the documents all traced back to the same profile, a now closed university account belonging to Professor Harold Litton, a name I recognized from an old faculty photo in the hall outside my office. Litton had retired in the early 90s and reportedly passed in 2004. I pulled an archived oral history recording he'd given to the university. At the end, when asked about the point of studying philosophy, he paused, then said, "To map the perimeter of the gate and to choose who walks through it." I listened to that line 3 more times. It didn't feel metaphorical. That night, I returned to the reading room with my phone and took a photo of the symbol. A reverse image search brought no results, but through a private academic forum I'd used during a sabbatical in Leuven, I found a 12-year-old comment on a deleted thread. It said, If you see the eye within the ring, don't speak, read. Attached was a PDF titled simply Translation, Notes from the Dark Gate. Page 1 read, compiled from marginalia, preserved at Elmsworth, Heidelberg, and Leuven. I'd found the breadcrumbs, now I couldn't help but follow them. The PDF was a collection of fragmented translations, annotations and sketches of what appeared to be philosophical rituals. At first it read like an eccentric study in comparative mysticism, but something felt wrong. The rituals were described, not as metaphor, but as practice. Each referenced configurations of symbols, times of day, planetary alignments, elements laid out with academic precision. These weren't ideas, they were instructions. Buried in the notes were citations for obscure lectures, some hosted at Elmsworth, others in European institutions with known ties to occult history. Cross-referencing these led me to a 1952 guest lecture listing for a Dr. Emil Karst, a name I'd just seen in the marginalia. He'd vanished from publishing records the year after. I found a surviving article of his in an obscure Belgian metaphysics journal. In its final paragraph, he wrote, "Our failure is not in seeking truth, but in believing it can be known without price. I started to see patterns. Names reappeared across centuries, slightly altered, often linked to failed courses or defunct departments. One particularly unsettling find, a man photographed in 1894 during a visiting lecture series, bore an exact resemblance to a current professor in our ethics department. Same posture, same faint scar under his left eye. The earlier figure had no recorded death." That night I received an anonymous email. No message. Just a subject line. "You're reading too deeply." It was enough. Someone was watching. And the order, whatever it was, hadn't died with the scholars. It had survived by becoming them. Digital leads had gone dry, so I turned to something older. I remembered a lecture years ago by a student researching Elmsworth's 19th century campus plans. She mentioned a chapel that predated the university, long since burned, but some ruins still existed, fenced off for safety. I found the overgrown gate behind West Hall. The lock was rusted through. Past the brush the ruins were quiet, half swallowed by time, cracked stone, collapsed arches, and the remnants of what looked like a sunken altar. Behind it, covered in leaves, I found a recessed hatch. It opened with effort. A ladder descended into blackness. I hesitated, then climbed down. The air changed, damp, metallic, still. At the bottom was a stone chamber, hexagonal and precise. In the center stood a pedestal, carved with the obsidian ring and the same vertical eye. Around it, etched in smooth concentric circles, were names in Latin and Greek. I recognized one immediately, my department chair. On the rear wall sat niches, holding a set of unmarked black books. I picked one. As I climbed back up, the hatch above closed gently. There was no wind, no visible mechanism. It felt less like I'd discovered a secret, and more like I'd been allowed inside. The book was warm in my hands, heavy, waiting. The book had no title, no index. Its pages were hand-copied in an elegant clinical script. The early passages echoed what I'd seen in the PDFs, ritual geometry, encoded instructions, philosophical axioms disguised as meditations. I scanned 10 pages into a private drive on the university server. Within minutes, I lost access to the archive. By morning, my faculty profile was gone. My staff login failed. Colleagues didn't mention it, but I saw the way they looked at me. Campus security conducted a routine safety inspection of my office and left with my hard drive. That night, my internet cut out at 3:12 a.m. When it came back, my browser history was blank. My student Callum didn't return to class. His name was gone from the roster. I checked housing records. His room had a different occupant. His ID number returned no results. I tried to stay off campus. I switched to cache, changed devices, and avoided routines. But the order didn't chase me. They simply edited me. One night, a manila envelope slid under my door. No note. Just a photo of me standing near the chapel ruins. On the back, the threshold cannot be half crossed. I no longer felt like a researcher, I felt like an initiate. I kept the book hidden, but it no longer stayed where I left it. Sometimes it opened to new pages, sometimes the diagrams were subtly different. It wasn't evidence anymore, it was a participant. I didn't intend to confront them, I was trying to disappear. But an internal memo announced a closed colloquium titled Philosophical Temporality and Transcendent Continuity. The location wasn't familiar, the time was listed only as sunset. I went. The entrance was concealed in the oldest part of the campus. A back corridor, unlit. My ID still worked. I descended alone. At the bottom, a wooden door carved with the obsidian ring opened as I approached. Inside sat 7 robed figures around a table. One stood. I knew the voice, Professor Harold Lytton, but he was supposed to have died in 2004. "You've read more than most," he said. "That grants you entry, not understanding." I asked him what the order was, what the Dark Gate really meant. He pointed to a stone-framed mirror at the far end of the room. It didn't reflect us, it reflected something else, a pulsing geometric chamber of impossible angles. "You think knowledge is earned," he said, "but true knowledge is offered. And offering requires sacrifice." One by one, the others removed their hoods. I recognized them from portraits, journals, citations. Faces lost to time. Faces still alive. Their eyes were dark and glassy, their skin pale, smooth, subtly inhuman. "Why me?" I asked. Lytton smiled. "Because you asked the wrong questions in the right way." The door behind me was gone. Only the mirror remained, and I wasn't afraid. I woke up in my apartment. The book was gone. My laptop is missing. My faculty login worked again. My name was back on the department site. Nothing had changed, but I had. The world felt thin, like a projection over something deeper. I kept teaching. Students showed up, but I noticed them more. One quoted Heraclitus with eerie cadence. Another cited a footnote I'd never seen. I stopped sleeping well. My dreams weren't dreams. They were blue-lit diagrams floating behind my eyelids. One evening, I found a note under my door. Witnesses are expected to choose. I haven't seen Callum since. Maybe he was real, maybe he wasn't. I considered publishing everything, but how do you explain a truth designed to be invisible? The order doesn't need to silence people. It reshapes the question so no one ever asks. Now I sit at my window watching lights flicker across old brick walls.
I see them sometimes, figures walking the halls after dark, faces not quite right, gazes that hold too long. I know what they are, and I'm no longer outside their circle, but I haven't chosen, not yet. I live in the space between belief
And surrender, between the symbol and the mirror, waiting to decide which version of me will remain. I never believed geometry could control people until I found the pattern buried in the heart of Paris. I was just supposed to give a talk, a guest lecture on classical symmetry in European monuments, something dry and harmless. I'd landed in Paris 3 days early to soak in the architecture, not from the usual tourist perspective, but through the lens of an urban planner. As I walked the winding streets from my rented flat near Montmartre to the Palais Garnier, something started to nag at me. It wasn't beautiful. It was the arrangement, the intersections, the sight lines, even the angles of the shadows. They felt off. Too precise, too conscious. I chalked it up to fatigue. Jet lag makes strange things seem stranger. But that first night I found myself staring at an old city map hanging in the apartment's hallway. It was framed under glass, faded and yellowed, marked with the curves of the Seine and radiating avenues like spokes from an unseen hub. The next morning I borrowed a compass and traced arcs between monuments. The Pantheon, the Arc de Triomphe,
Les Invalides. They connected, not loosely, not figuratively, but geometrically. Like the city had been composed not for function or beauty, but to encode something. I know how that sounds. I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. I was looking
for rhythm, harmony. But what I found didn't feel harmonious at all. It felt deliberate. I tried to let it go. But when I arrived at the university and met the department head, a retired architect named Julien Moreau, he caught me studying a blueprint of the city on his office wall. "You see it too, don't you?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "They always find the pattern eventually." I asked what he meant, but he only smiled, tired, almost apologetic, and said he'd leave something for me in the library archives under my name. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the alignment I'd seen, not just between buildings, but across entire districts. Paris hadn't evolved, it had been designed purposefully, as if the very act of walking its streets was meant to influence thought, emotion, behavior. I returned to the hallway map, stared at it in silence, then slowly turned it over. On the back, in faint pencil, was a symbol I didn't recognize. A triangle nested inside a circle, bisected by
a spiral. I didn't know it then, but that symbol would appear again.
In Rome, in Washington, and eventually beneath my own name. The envelope Julien Moreau left for me was unassuming, a simple folder marked Transit Studies, Urban Behavior, 1968-1974. I signed it out of the university archive that morning, my name handwritten in the logbook next to a column labelled Pattern Research. That struck me, but I kept quiet. Inside were 6 black and white aerial photos of Paris from different decades, each overlaid with transparent grids and strange symbols in red ink, spirals, nested triangles, golden ratios projected along avenues and plazas. It was beautiful, but unsettling. like someone had diagrammed a belief system into the city. The last page wasn't a map. It was a typeset note on old letterhead from the European Institute for Spatial Influence, a name I'd never heard. The note referenced a project codenamed Pax Vectra, with a single line underlined, "Influence is most effective when mistaken for coincidence." That evening I searched every academic database I had access to. No record of the Institute, no papers on Pax Vectra. But when I input the phrase into a forgotten urban planning forum I used to frequent, one thread popped up. A user named Cadmiel88 had posted a photo of a subway schematic from 1970s Rome with the same spiral and triangle symbol I'd seen in the Paris map. The post was 5 years old and buried under conspiracy chatter, but the diagram was real. And tagged to it was a cryptic caption. Same architects, different city, same intention. I clicked through their profile, which had been inactive since 2020, and followed a single outbound link, a Dropbox archive titled Dead Architects. It wasn't password protected. Inside were dozens of folders, city plans, declassified government memos, annotated construction blueprints. Some were from known cities, London, Vienna, Brasilia. Others were labelled only by coordinates. I downloaded them all. Over the next few nights I barely slept. I started comparing the monument grids across different cities. A strange consistency emerged, a tendency toward prime number spacing, mirrored layouts across national borders, and, most bizarrely, a recurring street alignment that perfectly mirrored the constellation Lyra. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was architecture as a signal, form as control. These weren't isolated plans, they were iterations of a master design. The deeper I dug, the more I realized I wasn't tracing the past. I was tracing a prediction. Somewhere in those files, hidden in the geometry, was a pattern pointing forward. A calendar, maybe. A countdown. And it had already started. I flew to Rome under the pretense of presenting at a heritage design conference, but my real focus was beneath the surface. The subway schematic from Cadmiel88's post had stuck with me, not just because of the symbol, but because of its date. April 1973. That year matched several documents in the Dead Architects archive, including one marked Roma R3 Vectra. Node activation. I found the location listed, a nondescript section of EUR, the district built under Mussolini's regime and later absorbed into Rome's fabric. On the surface it was concrete and clean lines, all stark geometry and fascist ambition, but beneath that something older stirred. I visited the regional archives and found a disused transport annex labelled closed for seismic risk. A friendly archivist let me view the records. Most were dry maintenance reports, but one memo stood out. It referenced a 1973 event called The Interruption, during which construction teams halted work due to an unexplained shift in compass alignment. True north had deviated by 11 degrees inside the chamber. They'd blamed local magnetism, but the engineers had flagged the incident as architecturally induced anomaly. I made copies and left before anyone asked questions. That night, in my hotel room, I reopened the Rome schematic. There it was, again, the spiral symbol intersecting line B near the closed annex. I pulled up another file from the Dropbox folder, one labelled Cartesian Harmonics, Urban Arrays and Predictive Behavior, co-authored by a man named Elias Brandt. I'd
never heard of him.
But his name kept recurring across cities, always in internal notes, never in public records. I found a single photo attached, grainy, black and white, taken in front of the Washington Monument. A man in his 40s with thick glasses standing, alone beside a brass surveying instrument. In the margin, someone had written, "Last survey, DC spiral complete." I searched Brandt's name through government archives, university rosters, even obituaries. Nothing. No record of him anywhere. He had been erased, or had erased himself. The pattern in the cities wasn't random. Each monument, park, and thoroughfare formed nodes of influence, not metaphysical, but behavioral. Public movement, attention drift, emotional clustering. And the files suggested something chilling. As global populations rose and technology tracked every step, the architectural patterns became self-sustaining. The cities were adapting, self-correcting, not to serve people, but to shape them. According to one document, we weren't supposed to notice until 2028. I had noticed in 2025. That meant I was early. That meant something had gone wrong. The coordinates led me to a patch of Maryland woods, 20 miles south of Washington, near the ruins of an old military facility labeled Site D17 on Cold War-era maps. On satellite images, the area looked unremarkable. An overgrown field, broken pavement, hints of concrete under years of dirt and moss. But within the files it had another name, Brandt's Grid. It was described as a controlled test environment for spatial influence metrics funded briefly under a defense psychological initiative that had never been formally acknowledged. I drove out early just after sunrise. There was no gate, no signage, just a rusted service road and silence. As I walked through what was once a main corridor, the foundation outlines of small structures appeared beneath the undergrowth, houses without walls, streets that led nowhere. I followed a faint path toward the center, where, according to the grid overlay I'd brought with me, a convergence point should exist. And there it was, a circle of stone set flush with the earth, 10 meters across, etched with geometric lines that mirrored the ones I'd seen in Paris and Rome. But here, untouched by traffic or time, they were sharper, intentional, not decoration, instruction. I set my phone's compass on the center and watched the needle rotate a full 40 degrees before settling. The lines pulled it off course, invisibly, insistently. I took out the notebook I'd been using to track symbols across cities and started sketching. The layout here wasn't just aesthetic, it formed a signal path, not for satellites or radio, but for human behavior, movement, pause, gaze direction, even the placement of benches, or in this case, their foundations, fed into a wider system of influence. I found a rusted panel half buried in dirt nearby. When I pried it up, there was a narrow tunnel descending into darkness, lined with decayed insulation and sealed wires. I used my phone light and climbed down carefully. At the bottom, I found a room no larger than a storage closet. Shelves lined one wall, still holding film reels and punched cards. In the corner was a projector and a metal case labelled Brandt, 1972-1976, Control Pattern Capture. Inside were transparencies of the city grid, notes in cramped handwriting, and one reel labelled simply Final Cycle. I didn't have a way to play it, but I knew what it was. The layout upstairs hadn't just been a test. It had been a forecast of how the cities would evolve when no one was watching. I climbed out of the tunnel slowly, my clothes damp, the light above blinding. In that silence, it became clear that Brandt hadn't disappeared. He'd buried his work, piece by piece, waiting for someone like me to dig it up. And I had. Now the question was, had I inherited the map or the warning? I wasn't naive enough to upload everything, just one map, a high-resolution scan of Brandt's grid, overlay for central Paris, annotated with the behavioral vectors and spiral ratios. I posted it on an obscure planning forum under an anonymous account I hadn't used in years. Within minutes, the thread was gone. Not deleted, erased, as if it had never existed. I checked my cloud drive. The folder I'd synced, labeled Urban Arrays Field Notes, was empty. My email booted me out with an alert. Multiple unauthorized login attempts. Then my phone vibrated. A single notification. Pattern breach flagged. Project ILX dormant. Do not continue. There was no app listed, no origin, just the message floating on my lock screen for 5 seconds before vanishing. I powered the phone down and removed the battery. It didn't matter. I knew what had happened. Someone, or something, was monitoring the artifacts. And whatever I'd triggered by posting Brandt's map had activated a dormant system. That night I noticed a car parked 2 buildings down from my apartment. Nondescript, but always idling. Windows tinted darker than factory standard. I told myself it was a coincidence. Until the next morning, when I returned from a walk and found my apartment door slightly ajar, the chain lock was still swinging. Nothing was stolen, but someone had been inside. They hadn't taken the physical files. They'd left those untouched. But the projector reel from Site D17 was gone. I hadn't even told anyone I'd found it. That was when I knew surveillance wasn't just digital, it was personal. I packed everything, photos, notes, sketches, and moved to a short-term rental across town, paying in cash, no ID. I used a laptop I'd bought second-hand, wiped, and kept off network. I stopped checking the forums. I stopped logging into anything. And yet, 2 nights later, someone slid an envelope under the door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message printed in red ink. There is still time, but not for disclosure, for correction. That word, correction, bothered me more than anything. It implied the cities weren't just influencing people. They were guiding us toward something, an outcome maybe, one that Brandt had tried to delay, but if that was true, then posting the map hadn't just been a breach. It had been a disruption, a deviation, and deviations, I was starting to realize, were not allowed. I returned to Paris under a different name, staying in a small studio off Rue des Martyrs, the kind of place where no one asked questions if you paid in cash. The envelope had changed everything. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, an offer even, a chance to stop before going too far. But I couldn't stop. Not after what I'd seen at Site D17, not after finding the same geometry mirrored in Washington's National Mall, Rome's Piazza del Popolo, and even in the grid lines of new developments in cities like Dubai and Shenzhen. The same spiral, always tucked just beneath the surface. I visited the Musée des Plans Reliefs, where models of historic cities are preserved under glass. I stared at the miniature version of Paris for hours, following the same lines I'd traced on my own map. That's when I noticed something new. A tiny mark carved into the base of the model, barely visible, a triangle inside a circle, bisected by a curve, Brandt's symbol. It hadn't been added recently, it was lacquered over part of the original display. Someone had been embedding signals in these models for decades, maybe longer. Not to preserve a plan, but to preserve a warning. I left the museum and took a long walk through the city, retracing the geometric lines on foot. And I started to notice it again, the way crowds shifted at intersections, the subtle placement of lampposts, benches, fountains, the pacing of foot traffic, almost rhythmic, as if we were all part of a current, not controlled, not forced, but influenced. I passed a plaza near the Sorbonne and stopped in my tracks. Inlaid in the stone underfoot was a new pattern, concentric, arcs intersecting with a spiral path recently restored. I checked the coordinates. It was a match to a point in Brandt's final forecast. One of the activation sites. I stood there for 15 minutes, pretending to read a tourist guide, watching people move through the space. Every step followed a pattern. No one deviated, not one. It wasn't programming in the digital sense, it was a spatial suggestion built into the very layout of the world. That night, I finally watched the reel from Site D17 on an analog projector at a friend's studio. There was no audio, just footage, time-lapse overlays of global city grids slowly shifting over decades, streets redrawn, monuments rebuilt, new neighborhoods rising exactly where the pattern required. At the end, a slide appeared, a date, 2030 E04.14, and one sentence beneath it. Pattern complete. Final generation engaged. I sat in the dark for a long time. That date was 5 years away. I wasn't a researcher anymore. I was a variable, a node, a participant, and whatever choice I thought I had, it was already accounted for. I left France 2 days after watching the reel, taking only what I could carry and mailing the rest to a contact I trusted in Rotterdam. Since then, I've kept moving. Amsterdam, Lisbon, Prague, never more than a few weeks in one place, always staying close to the old city centres, where the patterns are sharpest and the influence most complete. I still see the grids. Once you know how to look, they're everywhere. In the way a plaza empties at dusk, in the alignment of statues with crosswalks, in the rhythm of pedestrian lights that seem to slow when you're late and speed when you're lost. I used to believe cities were organic, born from the needs of the people who lived in them. But now I see that belief for what it was, a useful illusion. These places were designed not to reflect who we are, but to guide what we become. And the more I study the layouts, the more I understand the deeper truth. The dead architects weren't trying to control the world. They were trying to avert something. Brandt's final notes, now decoded, refer to a behavioral collapse point, a moment when the architecture's influence would no longer be corrective, but catalytic, not shaping behavior towards stability, but towards something else, something irreversible. That date, 2030-0414, wasn't the end of a plan, it was the point beyond which no intervention could change the outcome. In other words, we are the final variable, the last generation with any chance to interrupt the pattern. I've sent everything I have to 3 separate groups, 2 private, 1 academic. I don't know what they'll do with it. Maybe they'll suppress it. Maybe they'll laugh. Maybe, just maybe, someone will listen. As for me, I no longer pretend I can stay ahead of it. I see my path too clearly now. Every street I walk feels chosen. Every face I pass is placed. I wake in unfamiliar rooms, yet the window always looks out onto a perfect angle, always aligned. I'm not paranoid, I'm calibrated. And in quiet moments, when the city is still and the air carries that strange hum I can't quite locate, I wonder if Brandt ever felt this way near the end.
Not watched exactly, not hunted, just expected. I used to think the world was built for people. Now I think we were built to complete the world. I won't leave a manifesto. I won't leave instructions. I'll leave a question, the only
one that still matters. If everything around you was designed to make you feel free, how would you ever know you weren't? The wildfires in California weren't what pulled me in. It was how fast they disappeared from the news. I was in Quito when I first heard the term pattern drought. It sounded like media spin, one of those climate buzzwords reporters tossed around without understanding, but something about the way it was said caught my attention. I'd been traveling through South America, documenting soil degradation and seed extinction patterns, and writing freelance pieces that hardly paid for bus fare. Still I kept going, not out of hope, but obligation. I told myself I was chasing the truth, but in reality, I was running from burnout. My name is Maya Ortiz, and I used to believe we could fix the planet if we just worked hard enough. That belief ended on a Tuesday afternoon when I received a data set from a friend at NOAA. Anomalies in wildfire patterns across the Western Hemisphere, all eerily similar in timing, spread, and, most disturbingly, resolution. Fires that should have burned for weeks died out in hours. Satellite data showed cloud formation and sudden rainfall, localized, precise, and utterly unnatural. At first, I thought it was an error. Then I saw the same pattern repeated in Canada, Brazil, and Northern Australia. The file was pulled from the NOAA server the next morning. My contact, a climate analyst named Jules, went dark. His work email bounced and his phone sent me straight to voicemail. 3 days later, I received a private message on an encrypted forum I used years ago during my anti-fracking reporting. No name, just coordinates in Colorado and a time. I didn't know it then, but that message was the beginning of everything. It didn't feel like a warning or a threat. It felt like an invitation. The coordinates led me to a trailhead near Black Hollow Reserve, 2 hours outside Boulder. It was late afternoon when I arrived, clouds thick above the ridgeline, casting everything in a cold, dim light. There was no signal, no signs, just the crunch of gravel under my boots and the low groan of wind through skeletal trees. The air smelled faintly of ozone, like a storm that never came. I hiked in for about 40 minutes before I found the marker, 3 stones stacked beside a fallen pine, exactly where the message had said they'd be. Underneath was a weatherproof pouch containing a thumb drive and a note in block lettering. Watch everything. Don't save anything. If you're caught, you were never here. I didn't have a laptop with me, so I backtracked to town, booked a cheap room at a roadside inn, and used a burner Chromebook I kept in my trunk. The files were clean, no malware, no obvious tracebacks. But what they contained was worse than neat. I'd expected. Satellite overlays, global weather modification logs, climate simulation models that looked far beyond predictive. They were strategic. Dozens of PDFs detailed ecological interventions tied to documented disasters, redirected. Hurricanes, engineered droughts, rapid fire suppression. The timestamps went back decades. One file in particular chilled me. Phase 3, soil reclamation via event-based population management. Inside were transcripts, meetings, briefings, some redacted, some not. One name kept appearing, the Elders. At first, I thought it was a code name or maybe an ironic label, but the language they used was cold, structured, and disturbingly philosophical. Phrases like selective balance, acceptable ecological loss, and threshold reset protocols appeared again and again, framed as if they were metrics of success. There were references to the garden, always capitalized, often described not as a place but a model. It wasn't until I dug into the metadata that I realized what I was looking at. Internal files from a group embedded across scientific, military, and environmental agencies, none of which officially acknowledged their existence. That night, I didn't sleep. I reread everything twice, destroyed the drive as instructed, and left the motel before sunrise. I didn't know who they were or how far this went, but I knew one thing for certain. The fires I'd been studying weren't natural disasters. They were controlled burns, and someone, somewhere, was choosing who got to survive. I drove east through Nebraska, avoiding interstates, switching burner phones every 100 miles. The paranoia hadn't set in yet, not fully, but I knew enough not to stay in one place for too long. Somewhere outside Lincoln, I stopped at a 24-hour library kiosk, logged in through a proxy, and started piecing together the fragments from memory. The Elders wasn't a name you could just search, but the garden led me down a different path: academic journals, declassified policy briefs, and a series of obscure conference notes hosted under the guise of agricultural resilience initiatives. The oldest document I found was a 1972 white paper titled Ecological Equilibrium and Human Density: Strategic Considerations, authored by someone named I. Graymont. The paper discussed a post-industrial model for maintaining planetary carrying capacity, not through innovation or sustainability, but through subtraction. It read like a manifesto dressed in scientific language, calling for periodic resets to prevent resource tipping points. I cross-referenced the author with a set of UN symposium attendees from the early 80s. The name didn't appear anywhere, but several contributors cited his work obliquely as if invoking a foundational theory no one dared name. I compiled the references and began to see patterns. Every few years, a different disaster, drought, flood, famine, would erupt in a seemingly unconnected region. But behind each one, if you looked closely, there were signs of prior knowledge. A wheat storage facility moved weeks before a dust storm in Turkmenistan. A remote vaccination campaign pulled just days before a cholera outbreak in Mozambique. In isolation, they meant nothing. Together, they looked like a doctrine. I found one name repeated in the margins of a scanned planning document, the Stilling Initiative. It was referenced in the context of demographic throttling and reclamation through stabilization. I followed that lead to an old climate network subdomain, long dead but partially archived. A comment buried in an HTML footer included GPS coordinates off the coast of Maine and one sentence I couldn't shake: No forest grows without pruning. That night, parked in a rest stop under a canopy of swaying oaks, I sat with a notebook open on my lap, listing every coincidence, every name, every place. I wasn't chasing a conspiracy anymore. I was tracing the operations of a system old enough to predate the language we used to describe it. The elders weren't acting randomly. They were following something old, something written. The coordinates took me to a stretch of coastline just south of Acadia, Maine, dense pine forest running right up to the cliffs. There were no signs, no trails, just a break in the tree line and a gravel path grown over with moss and weeds. I parked a quarter-mile out and walked in with nothing but a flashlight, gloves and an old press badge I kept for situations where I needed to lie quickly. The path ended at a rusted gate, barely hanging onto its hinges. Beyond it, the remnants of what had once been a private research facility slumped beneath the weight of decades, shattered glass, buckled siding, and vines snaking through cracks in the concrete. The place hadn't just been abandoned, it had been erased. Inside, the air was thick with mold and salt. I stepped over collapsed filing cabinets and sifted through drawers of faded labels and water-damaged folders. Most were blank, but one basement lab, still partially intact, held something else. The power had long since failed, but a few devices remained intact: an air filtration monitor, several broken centrifuges, and a server rack sealed inside a dehumidified case. It was empty, wiped clean, but someone had etched coordinates onto the casing with a utility knife, 6 digits, 3 decimals, too precise to be random. I wrote them down and kept moving. In the corner of the lab was a locked cabinet. I forced it open with a rusted crowbar and found a metal case inside. It was filled with hard copy maps, topographic overlays marked with black triangles and red zones that followed no political or geographical logic. On the back of each map was a short line of text in different handwriting styles. Adjustments required, pending regression. Not yet aligned. These weren't just locations, they were timelines. Environmental sequences predicted years in advance, tied not to weather models but human population densities. Taped to the inside of the case was a photo, curled and yellowing. It showed 5 people standing in front of a glass table scattered with the same maps. Their faces were obscured, but one woman wore a pin on her lapel, a stylized tree encircled by a broken ring. I'd seen that symbol once before, embedded in the footer of a leaked World Food Council document marked Internal Scenario Only. That night, I slept in my car. Every sound outside became a threat, every movement in the woods a watcher. I wasn't just following breadcrumbs anymore. I was trespassing in someone's domain, someone who didn't want to be remembered. And wherever this path led, I had the growing sense that it wasn't meant to end in daylight. I uploaded a summary of my findings to a secure, journalistic dead drop I hadn't used in years. It was a habit I'd learned back when I was covering illegal deforestation in the Amazon. Always leave a trail in a place they can't fully erase. I didn't name names or cite the elders directly, just outlined the patterns, the maps, the evidence that someone, somewhere, was choosing when and where nature would take its toll. Within 48 hours, the file had been accessed twice from masked IPs, one in Brussels, the other somewhere near Nairobi. On the third day, my laptop bricked itself mid-boot. I didn't try to fix it. Instead, I ditched it in a creek and switched to an analog notebook. That night, I caught a reflection in a diner window. Just a man across the parking lot, leaning against a Civic that didn't belong in a town this small. I stayed calm, finished my food, and left through the kitchen. From then on, I moved, only at night, staying in cheap motels or rest stops, paying in cash, keeping my head down. The pressure wasn't overt, but it was there. Strange emails with no sender, hotel room doors that didn't close quite right, a click on the line during
calls that should have been encrypted.
The elders didn't need to threaten me. Their silence said enough. Still, I couldn't stop. I found a contact through an old activist network, someone who claimed to know about the garden, someone who'd gone dark a few years back after exposing a weather station in Mongolia that was rerouting jet streams. He sent me a single message: "You're not wrong, but it's not science, it's scripture." Attached was a PDF scan of a text called the Seed Doctrine, dated 1611, written in a mix of Latin and Old English. It described a philosophy of cycles, natural destruction as a divine mandate, and the role of custodians in maintaining the balance. What disturbed me wasn't the age of the document, but how closely it mirrored the terminology in the elders' internal files. Adjustment zones, soil redemption, threshold culling. It wasn't just belief, it was policy rooted in prophecy. I had a choice: release what I had and risk being discredited, or go deeper and find someone willing to stand beside the truth with me. I chose the latter. But that meant coming out of the shadows. I scheduled a meeting with an investigative editor I trusted in DC, someone who once told me the hardest stories are the ones you're never ready to tell. I never made it to the meeting. My train car was delayed. The editor cancelled, citing a security audit at her office. And when I checked into my hotel that night, the clerk smiled too long, as if he already knew my name. I left the hotel before dawn and drove south without a destination, guided only by instinct and exhaustion. Somewhere outside Richmond, I pulled off into a truck stop lot and sat in the silence until the sun came up. My notes were a mess, scattered across notebooks and torn receipts, but one thread kept circling back: the prophetic text. The Seed Doctrine wasn't just a belief system, it was a blueprint, passed down and modified through centuries, binding ecological collapse to cycles of moral failure. I dug into its origin using university archives and scanned theological indexes. The name Greymont reappeared in footnotes dating back to the 1800s, tied to a series of closed-door symposiums on population ethics and land inheritance. The elders hadn't just found this text. They'd built a structure around it, institutionalized it, and used it as justification for geoengineered events masked as natural crises. I found references to the garden in a restricted USDA grant proposal from the 1990s. It wasn't a place, it was a framework, a control system disguised as conservation, floodgates disguised as policy. I needed confirmation, something undeniable. Through a contact in Maryland's Public Records Division, I obtained a decommissioned land use map with layers intact. One polygon, marked simply as ELD-01, matched the coordinates from the rusted server case back in Maine. It was a tract of dense, inaccessible forest wrapped in federal conservation status, with no logging, no trails, and no flyover permissions. I drove straight there, parked a mile out, and hiked in through an underbrush so thick it shredded my jacket. At the center of the zone was a structure, low, angular, and half buried in the earth. Not a building exactly, more like a monument. Stone blocks arranged in a spiral, each etched with a different year and a corresponding population figure. The pattern was unmistakable. Each number followed a sharp drop after major ecological events: Chernobyl, the Sahel drought, the Pacific quake cluster. It was a silent ledger. I filmed everything, careful not to upload or transmit, just analog, backup. As I turned to leave, I saw it, faint but clear. Another symbol carved into the stone, the broken ring around the tree. Below it, in smaller text, a line that ended the debate for me. By hand, by fire, by design. For the balance to hold, some roots must die. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I sat in the car, camera on my lap, footage unspooled, beside me, and felt everything fall away. My work, my doubt, my belief in reform. They weren't reshaping nature. They were shaping us. I never published the footage. I came close, twice. Once from a cafe in Asheville, finger hovering over the upload button, and once from a borrowed workstation in a university media lab, my heart pounding in my ears as the progress bar inched forward. Both times I stopped. Not out of fear, though. Fear was always present, but because something deeper had shifted in me. The truth, once revealed, didn't free me. It broke me. For months I drifted from place to place, keeping no fixed address, living off-grid in the quiet spaces between
cities.
I'd stare at forests the way I used to stare at hard drives, waiting for the pattern to emerge. And it always did. Crops that failed in just the right zip code. Wildfires that halted precisely at district lines. Rain that fell like clockwork. Over corporate farmland while reservoirs dried up just one county over. I saw their fingerprints everywhere. At first it hollowed me out. I questioned everything, my work, my cause, even the people I used to trust. If catastrophe could be orchestrated, then so could progress. What did activism mean in a world where disaster was scripted? But time softens even the sharpest truths. Eventually I stopped chasing proof and started listening. Not to data, but to people. Displaced farmers in Utah, water guardians in Oaxaca, families rebuilding homes on floodplains they were told would never flood again. I didn't tell them about the elders, I didn't show them the maps or the footage, I just listened. And somewhere in their stories I found the answer I didn't know I was looking for. The elders weren't gods, they were gamblers playing, long odds with the language of inevitability. But people endure. They adapt. And while the garden may have been designed as a system of control, it was also fragile, dependent on secrecy, vulnerable to exposure. I mailed copies of the footage to 3 journalists under false names and haven't checked if any of them were published. That part isn't mine anymore. I live quietly now in a place where the trees still remember how to bend with the wind. I plant when I can. I document what I see. And every so often when the sky goes grey and the air tastes of coming rain, I whisper the words carved into that stone by hand, by fire, by design, not as a warning, but as a reminder. Some roots must die, but others, if left alone, find a way to grow back stronger.